안녕하십니까? 오늘 국제사회서비스프로젝트 제3차 포럼의 사회를 맡은 김경미 아나운서입니다. 반갑습니다. 오늘 포럼은 코로나19 감염 예방을 위해 한국사회복지협의회 공식 유튜브 채널 나눔 채널 공감에서 실시간으로 진행합니다. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third international project on social service seminar. I am Kyungmi Kim, the host for today's seminar. Today's seminar is streaming live through the official YouTube channel of Korea National Council on Social Welfare, 나눔 채널 공감, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Strategies for ensuring social protection. Experts all around the world will discuss how to overcome the food crisis and the post-COVID-19 era in connection with the establishment of social protection in Africa. 오늘 진행되는 포럼은 한국사회복지협의회가 추진하는 국제사회서비스 프로젝트 일환으로 지속가능 개발 목표와 사회의 이슈를 연결하여 현안과 시사점을 짚어보는 SDGs 국제포럼입니다. 이번 포럼은 빈곤과 식량 문제를 주제로 진행합니다. 아프리카의 식량 위기, 국제개발 협력에 관심 있는 분이시라면 많은 곳에서 접해보셨을 텐데요. 식량 위기는 국제사회의 정치, 사회적 논의에서 빠지지 않는 주제입니다. 특히 코로나19의 세계적인 확산 추세가 쉽게 가라앉지 않고 있고 이는 세계 무역의 침체로 이어지고 있습니다. 때문에 아프리카 지역의 많은 국가들이 상상할 수 없을 정도의 식량 위기에 직면하고 있다고 합니다. 이번 포럼에서는 아프리카의 식량 위기의 현안과 해결 방안, 조금 더 큰 범위에서의 사회안전망 구축에 대해 논의해보고자 해외 여러 나라의 사회개발 전문가들을 모셨습니다. 총 4회에 걸쳐 개최하고 있는 국제사회 서비스 프로젝트 지속가능개발 국제포럼. 세 번째로 개최하는 오늘 포럼에서 많은 정보를 얻어가시기 바랍니다. 이번 행사는 코로나19 상황에 따라 비대면 유튜브 중계로 진행합니다. 다소 지루한 순간이 있으시다면 채팅창에서 다른 참가자분들과 자유롭게 의견을 나눠보시는 건 어떨까요? 지금 유튜브를 보고 계시는 여러분들께서는 실시간 채팅을 통해 참여가 가능합니다. 오늘 주제에 대한 다양한 의견을 채팅창에 남겨주시면 추후에 저희가 추첨을 통해 작은 선물을 보내드릴 예정입니다. 여러분의 많은 참가를 부탁드립니다. 그럼 오늘 포럼 프로그램을 안내해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 포럼은 3개 세션으로 진행됩니다. 첫 번째 세션에서는 아프리카의 식량 불안과 아동 보호, 두 번째 세션에서는 아프리카 식량 불안정 문제의 해결 방안 모색, 세 번째 세션에서는 사회 안전망 구축을 위한 통합적인 접근 방안을 주제로 진행이 되겠습니다. 그럼 포럼을 시작하기에 앞서 국제사회복지협의 회장이자 한국사회복지협의 회장이신 서상목 회장님의 개회사가 있겠습니다.
안녕하세요. 한국사회복지협의회 회장 서상목입니다. 오늘 국제사회서비스 프로젝트 3차 포럼에 참가해 주신 여러분 진심으로 반갑습니다. 코로나19 사회적 거리 두기 지침에 따라서 비대면 포럼으로 이번 행사를 진행하게 되었습니다. 국제사회복지협의회와 한국사회복지협의회가 공동으로 주최하는 오늘 포럼은 빈곤과 식량 문제를 주제로 진행을 할 예정입니다. 이번 포럼에서는 아프리카의 빈곤과 식량 문제를 해결하기 위해 어떤 사회복지 정책과 또 사회 안전망 구축이 필요할지에 대해서 논의를 하고자 합니다. UN 식량농업기구의 세계 식량위기 보고서에 따르면 세계 기아 인구는 2020년 1억 3천만 명이 증가를 해서 모두 8억 1천만 명에 이를 것이라고 합니다. 기후변화와 또 코로나19 대유행으로 경제적 침체와 함께 여러 악재가 겹치면서 세계 식량 문제는 국제사회의 중요한 이슈가 되고 있습니다. 고소득 국가에서는 식료품의 과잉 소비가 발생하는 반면에 저소득 국가에서는 공급 부족 사태가 일어나는 등 그 불평등은 시간이 갈수록 더욱 심화되고 있는 실정입니다. 지난 9월 뉴욕에서 열린 UN 총회에서도 푸드 시스템 서밋을 개최를 해서 코로나 팬데믹 상황에서의 그 식품 시스템에 대한 내용을 아주 비중 있게 다뤘습니다. 국제사회가 식량을 생산하고 또 소비하는 데 있어 지속 가능한 개발 목표를 달성하기 위해 우리 모두의 행동과 또 협력이 필요하다는 것을 인식하는 기회가 되었다고 생각을 합니다. 이처럼 오늘 포럼에서도 푸드 시큐리티에 관련한 현황을 살펴보고 또 국제사회가 어떤 노력을 기울여야 할지에 대한 의견을 나누고자 여러 나라의 그 사회개발 전문가 분들을 초청을 했습니다. 포럼 내용으로는 먼저 아프리카의 식량 문제의 현황에 대해 살펴보고요. 이어서 사회안전망 구축을 위한 통합적인 접근 방안에 대해 해외 전문가들의 발표가 이어지겠습니다. 이번 포럼을 통해서 참가자 여러분이 사회개발 문제에 조금 더 쉽게 다가가고 또 다양한 의견을 나누는 정보 교류의 장이 되기를 기대를 합니다. 한국사회복지협의회는 포스트 코로나 시대의 새로운 글로벌 사회개발 이슈를 선도하고자 국제사회복지협의회 등 국제기구와 협력을 해서 다양한 국제협력 사업을 진행을 하고 있습니다. 오는 11월에는 포스트 코로나 시대의 사회 안전망을 주제로 해서 4차 포럼을 개최할 예정입니다. 포스트 코로나 시대의 새로운 사회 안전망 구축을 위해 정부, 기업, 그리고 시민사회 역할은 무엇일지에 대해 함께 의견을 나누고자 합니다. 향후 개최되는 포럼에도 많은 관심 부탁을 드리겠습니다. 이번 포럼을 통해서 많은 정보를 얻어가시기를 바라며 다시 한번 오늘 포럼에 참석해 주신 많은 분들께 진심으로 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 항상 건강하시길 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
네, 회장님 말씀 대단히 감사합니다. 다음으로는 보건복지부 양성일 차관님께서 축사를 보내주셨습니다. 차관님을 바로 만나보시죠.
안녕하십니까. 보건복지부 1차관 양성일입니다. 국제사회서비스프로젝트 포럼에 참가해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 그리고 행사 개최를 위해 애써주신 한국사회복지협의회 서상목 회장님, 국제사회복지협의회 및 해외 사회복지 관계자분들에게도 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 특히 바쁘신 일정 속에서도 아프리카의 빈곤과 식량 문제를 해결하기 위한 사회안전망 구축 주제로 귀한 말씀을 준비해 주신 10분의 사회개발 전문가께도 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 쉽사리 가라앉지 않고 있는 코로나19 대유행으로 국제사회는 유례없는 어려움을 겪고 있습니다. UN 세계식량계획에 따르면 올해 말에는 약 2억 7천만 명의 인구가 코로나19로 심각한 수준의 기근을 경험하게 될 것이라고 합니다. 이러한 점에서 이번 포럼에서 다루는 아프리카의 빈곤과 식량 문제를 해결하기 위한 사회안전망 구축은 매우 시의적절한 글로벌 이슈이기에 오늘 이 자리를 매우 뜻깊게 생각합니다. 오늘 포럼이 사회개발 전문가들의 정보 교류의 장이 되어 아프리카 지역의 식량 불안정 문제를 해결할 수 있는 다양한 방안이 논의될 수 있기를 기대합니다. 특히 식량 불안정 상황에서 가장 취약한 아동에 대한 보호 방안이 모색되어 현장에 큰 도움이 되기를 기대합니다. 지난 6월 G20 회원국들은 2030년까지 전 세계적으로 굶주리는 사람이 전혀 없는 제로 헝거 달성을 목표로 포용적이고 탄력적인 식량 생산 시스템을 구축하고 이를 통해 모든 사람이 적절하게 영양을 공급받도록 노력하자는 마테라 선언을 채택한 바 있습니다. 아울러 한국 정부는 국제사회의 기하 종식과 식량 안보 문제 해결을 위한 협력을 강화하고자 지난 7월 UN 세계 식량 계획과 맺은 기본 협력 협정을 갱신했습니다. 앞으로도 보건복지부는 한국사회복지협의회와 함께 국제사회의 빈곤 문제를 비롯한 사회안전망 글로벌 이슈를 선도하기 위해 최선을 다하겠습니다. 다시 한번 오늘 포럼에 참여해 주신 모든 분께 감사드리며 빠른 시일 내로 코로나19 상황이 좋아져서 직접 뵐 수 있기를 기대합니다. 여러분 항상 건강하시고 행복하시길 기원하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
차관님 말씀 대단히 감사합니다. 이어서 세계 식량 문제 해결을 위한 국제기구인 국제농업개발기금 IFAD의 조이스 녀루 책임연구원의 축사를 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I want to thank the International Council on Social Welfare for inviting IFAD to present their experiences on this very, very important subject. Yeah, so I think, and I think maybe it is something that is not spoken in all environments or different sectors, but it is a very important factor on social protection to think about in all the different programs that all different agencies are involved in. And maybe just adding to what you've just heard, I think, why is this conversation very important at this time? We know that Africa is home to almost 9 out of 10 extremely poor people in the world. And before COVID-19 pandemic, the 2030 poverty forecast was 26%, very far from reaching the 2030 objective. And also that we've just heard about the food security situation and the fact that the highest population of those who are food insecure are living in our continent. And further to that, almost 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25 years. So this makes Africa the world's youngest continent with about 11 million young people who are joining the Africa labor market each year. And we know that the continent only generates 3.7 million jobs annually. So for many youths, the informal sector becomes the default rather than the exception. And at the same time, also when you talk about the informal sector, also think about agriculture, bigger sector. Then other factors that make this subject very important at this moment is the fragility and conflict, which is a key challenge that has increased in the continent's vulnerability to multiple shocks, threatening the efforts to build sustainable and equitable food systems towards achievement of SDGs. Then similarly, the effect of climate change, which you've just also heard, the unpredictable weather patterns, which are increasingly affecting food security from production all the way to consumption. And then last but not least, the global COVID-19 pandemic, which has also significantly affected food and nutrition security of the continent, which relies on imports for essential food products and also for the major cereals, and amplified the continent's challenge to access healthy, nutritious, and affordable food, making 46 million more people hungry. So with this in mind and bearing this in mind, it would not be enough to speak about food security without making reference to the food system challenges that have failed to make nutritious diets accessible or affordable to all. And so I think then I ask the question then, why social protection? So in light of all these factors, it is important that governments and all actors take actions and interventions to reduce levels of vulnerability, risk, and deprivation that prevent vulnerable populations to access to equal rights to become full citizens. So social protection will protect households from harmful coping strategies like selling productive assets while managing risk. It also enhances people's resilience in the face of shocks and structural transformations. So these measures would have either direct or indirect impacts to the food and nutrition security of children. We know that if a child is undernourished, they may have irreversible cognitive impairment that prevents the child to live to their full potential. Similarly, we've all had also some of the effects of even of COVID, and these issues were there before, early pregnancies, which can also lead to impairment in development of young girls. And at the same time, there's a risk of intergenerational cycle malnutrition. So all these social issues are very important, and we need to address them in the continent. So specifically, just maybe to share with you what IFAD is doing when it comes to social protection. IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And IFAD has a strategic framework which has the development objective of investing in rural people to enable them to overcome poverty and achieve food security through remunerative, sustainable, and resilient livelihoods. But nevertheless, very few programs or investments would formally be called social protection. And yet, if you look at the strategic objectives that of IFAD, they do relate directly or indirectly to social protection. And this is because primarily IFAD investments and grants are in relatively underserved rural areas of the world and support the poorest of the poor and the poor. So specifically, IFAD's comparative advantage therefore lies in its strong targeting of extremely poor and food insecure people in rural areas, and its focus on empowering them to build their resilience, promote their livelihoods, and increase their productive capacity and market linkages, including in difficult contexts experiencing famine, drought, fragility, and migration. So for IFAD then, rural social protection activities entail taking actions and investments that reduce vulnerability risk and deprivation of the rural poor, particularly smallholder producers, indigenous peoples, the landless, displaced people, women, and the young. And I think we've had a very good experience, especially with the pandemic, that we are learning more on how to work more on social protection. And in the response to the pandemic, IFAD came up with a rural poor stimulus facility, which aimed to improve the resilience of rural livelihoods by ensuring timely access to inputs, information, markets, and liquidity. And this fund also aimed to promote social protection measures by providing inputs and basic assets for production of crops, livestock, and fisheries, facilitating access to markets to support small-scale farmers in selling their products and conditions where market functions are restricted, also targeting funds for rural financial services to ensure sufficient liquidity and to ease repayment requirements so as to maintain services, markets, and jobs. And also at the same time, also promoting the use of digital services to deliver key information on production, weather, finances, and markets. So more broadly, some of the specific measures that IFAD is taking is to transform agricultural systems for improved rural livelihoods through productive and profitable small farms. As we know that most people live in rural areas, and most earn their incomes at least in part from working on small farms or in other parts of the food system. So the failings of food systems damage the livelihoods of rural people across the world, and they are a threat for human health, the environment, global stability, nutrition, and also our children's future. So small-scale farming, therefore, enables these rural people to feed themselves, their families, and communities. And according to the IFAD Rural Development Report, despite small-scale farming systems contributing over half of the calories produced in the world, the farmers and other rural people are disproportionately represented among the numbers of poor and hungry, with indigenous peoples, women, and youth being particularly vulnerable. So they also face challenges of access to inputs, services, financial support, and profitable markets to improve their production and incomes. So IFAD addresses these challenges through promoting equitable transformation of food system with small-scale farmers at its center, and complemented by midstream small-scale enterprises that link them with essential services and markets, as well as providing them with opportunities to diversify into off-farm employment. And looking at maybe promoting healthier diets of poor people, because if you talk about food security, then diets are important. And I think the statistics are clear out there. And it is then important that we empower the poor, including women working in food system, to earn better incomes and have more options and autonomy regarding the food they choose to eat, and can yield significant benefits in health nutrition outcomes, particularly for young children. And to reduce these nutrition gaps, our food systems transformation needs to have 4 dimensions: driving consumer choices towards healthier diets, empowering women and other disadvantaged groups, strengthening rural-urban linkages, and improving physical access to diverse food markets and outlets. And IFAD has committed to make 50% of its investments nutrition sensitive in order to deliver adequate, nutritious diets for all, and particularly women and the children. And in the same breath, when you talk about children, this also includes youth as well. And so creating new employment opportunities for youth unlocks the potential of food systems midstream. And we know that youth unemployment is very high in Africa. And the agriculture sector is an opportunity to create attractive and decent jobs for youth, which includes training and skills development. So by creating small and medium enterprises along the value chains, we can create jobs, and while also giving small-scale farmers new ways to access both markets and non-farm employment opportunities while supplying healthier foods that meet consumer demand. So generally, as I conclude, I also want to talk about investments, because IFAD is an international financial institution. So we are having new initiatives also, like the Resilience Food Systems Program, which is advancing an integrated and holistic approach, focusing specifically on promoting sustainability and resilience in small farming systems through management of the natural resources, land, water, soils, trees, and genetic resources that underpin food and nutrition security. So this program will have about 1 billion being invested in 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And a large part of the fund will focus on developing agri-food value chains in equipping women with the tools and networks they need to earn a sustainable income. So in conclusion, I would say that to have this conversation on food security, it will be important to take a food systems view that also addresses the challenges within all the different factors or drivers of the food systems for us to really meet the child-sensitive social protection that also addresses food security. And then finally, that it is important to take a life cycle approach to address challenges that affect children, because not all interventions will target the child directly, but others also we need to look at the entire household if we want to address to make sure that the child protection issues are also addressed. Over and thank you very much.
다음은 글로벌 푸드뱅킹 네트워크 리사문 회장님의 축사가 준비되어 있습니다. 함께 만나보시죠.
Greetings. My name is Lisa Moon, and I am the President and CEO of the Global Food Banking Network. It is my pleasure to congratulate the International Council on Social Welfare and its partners in convening this timely and important conversation on addressing food insecurity in Africa and child-sensitive social protections. As many in attendance know, the COVID-19 pandemic has widened inequality. ICSW is well positioned to lead a conversation on these topics, as NGOs and civil society players have been a driving force in responding to the economic and social crises created by the pandemic. Unfortunately, new global research from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations indicates that an estimated 2.3 billion people face food insecurity, and nearly half of the world's population is not able to afford a nutritious or diverse diet. At the same time, the International Labor Organization projects that 1 in 2 people worldwide do not have access to any form of social protection. These limitations have meant that much of the work of serving vulnerable populations has fallen on civil society. You all, as members of ICSW, know this too well. The Global Food Banking Network connects food recovery organizations in 44 countries. These food banks work to procure surplus and parts of the food system that would otherwise go to waste and redirect it to local NGOs that are addressing the root causes of hunger and poverty. The food banking model began more than 50 years ago and has since been adapted in hundreds of communities worldwide, and most recently in major urban areas of sub-Saharan Africa. Over the past 18 months, our organizations have seen firsthand the consequences of inadequate social protections. 6 months into the pandemic, 91% of our members were seeing more requests for emergency food assistance. The food banks and the social service agencies they support were facing significant funding shortfalls. Financial and product donations had declined, but new partners came forward and helped power an incredible humanitarian response. In 2020, food banks in our network provided budget relieving support to nearly 60,000 local nonprofits. During this time, 40 million people turned to a local food bank for support. 17.6 million of these people were children. As you may know, prior to the pandemic, about a third of all children face malnutrition. Children have been especially adversely affected, and this is really discouraging as international players have been working for nearly a decade to advance child nutrition by reducing stunting and wasting, reducing anemia in women of childbearing age, supporting children in maintaining a healthy weight, and increasing rates of breastfeeding. These targets were set up by the World Health Assembly in 2012 with a goal date of completion for 2025, and reaching them will be made all the more difficult. We have learned in the food banking world that numerous interventions mitigate malnutrition if applied during the 1,000-day window between pregnancy and a child's second birthday. And a proven intervention that food banks especially focus on is on educating girls, keeping them in school so they have better livelihood opportunities so that they're able to choose who and when they marry and choose to have a family if and when they are ready. School meals are a proven mechanism to boost school attendance and improve nutrition, improve academic performance, especially for girls. But as schools shuttered during the pandemic, children lost access to an important social safety net, meals at school. In fact, 370 million children worldwide, many of whom are reliant on meals as a key source of nutrition, missed out on about 40% of the calories and nutrients that they would have normally consumed in school due to the pandemic. Even as schools resume, we are facing a reality that there are far too many national school feeding programs worldwide, and in places where they do exist, their coverage is at times insufficient. So GFN food banks are actively supporting millions of children, including providing meals at school in 25 countries. We are especially grateful to our partner, Korea National Council on Social Welfare, who runs Korea Food Bank, who has been a thought and implementation partner with GFN on its work focused on child hunger. But it is because of these complex issues that the Global Food Banking Network looks forward to learning from these fruitful conversations on new ways to address food insecurity and advance child-sensitive social protections in Africa. My congratulations again to ICSW and to Dr. Suh for convening this important conversation. We look forward to the results.
네, 말씀 대단히 감사합니다. 그럼 지금부터 국제사회서비스 프로젝트 SDGs 3차 포럼, 빈곤과 식량 문제, 아프리카 사회복지 정책과 사회안전망 구축을 위한 전략을 시작하겠습니다. 첫 번째 순서로 마이클 샘슨 남아공 윌리엄스 대학교 경제정책연구소 소장님의 기조 강연을 함께 하시겠습니다.
And let me thank everyone here for the opportunity to present all this research to you. Let me go back to the beginning here. Over the next 25 minutes, what I'd like to do is cover the what, the why, and the how of food insecurity and malnutrition, and what child-sensitive social protection can contribute to a solution. I want to start with the current situation. The past year has had a devastating impact, and it's not just the pandemic, it's how COVID-19 has interacted with a number of pre-existing stresses and shocks and crises. And these comorbidities, they vary by region. We see, for example, instability in Central Africa and climate shocks in East Africa, political crises in Southern Africa, conflict in West Africa as some of the predominating shocks and crises that are interacting with COVID to exacerbate food insecurity. We've seen an increase of 60% or more in people facing food crisis. And the pandemic has certainly contributed enormously to that. And nutrition is a complex challenge in the best of times. It's vital to get a number of key policy interventions to work effectively together. And COVID has just thrown a wrench into that gear work. It's overwhelmed healthcare systems, it's disrupted food supply chains, and very devastatingly, it has shocked the livelihoods of billions of people around the world and hundreds of millions of people in Africa. And our modeling demonstrates that, let me see, there we go. Oops, my computer's a little sticky. The increase in multi-dimensional child deprivation across the continent has been devastating. This is confirmed by numerous empirical studies. In Jordan, we see a near quadrupling of child deprivation. And most of this increase is in the top 3 quintiles of the population. These are households that have not faced severe vulnerability before. Similarly, in South Africa, most of the increase is in this group of newly vulnerable people. And this has created, COVID has created a new vulnerability, a new poverty, and has highlighted the vital importance of social protection, particularly universal social protection. But I want to focus for a minute on a dimension that social protection as a policy area has not grappled with enough over the past few decades, and that's digital poverty. We understand social protection as a social service, but it's a special social service. It has the role of ensuring, in addition to its core interventions like cash transfers and health insurance, it has a role to ensure everyone has access to all the other vital services. And social protection in this access role has focused on health, it's focused on education, it's focused on nutrition, it's focused on child protection, but it hasn't focused enough on digital poverty. And digital poverty is addressed by digital access, connecting people to the internet. And it is a more complex domain. Education tends to be developmental. Healthcare tends to be developmental. Cash transfers are developmental. Digital technologies, yes, they're a domain of potential deprivation. People don't have access to communication services, information services, that can lock them out of financial services as well. But it can also be a driver of deprivation, misinformation, or unscrupulous financial operators who abuse digital connectivity can further impoverish vulnerable households. But it's also, very importantly, a potential catalyst for development. And the pandemic has demonstrated all around the world the vital role technology can play, first in enabling more effective social protection systems, through management information systems, through e-payment mechanisms, better enabling people to access their social protection benefits. But inclusive digital technologies have gone further. They've enabled emergency remote learning, telehealth, e-markets, when physical markets are shut down. They enable people to work from home and strengthen adaptive livelihoods. They have enormous potential in enabling more productive rural development. But that's all for naught if people are not connected to the internet, if people don't have access. This pandemic has demonstrated, both for food security and nutrition, but for also broader development, how vitally important digital poverty is as an issue to tackle and an area to stress. Now, over the past year, we have seen, my computer is a little sticky here. Starting in March last year, substantial. What's my computer here? Okay, 1 second here. We'll get back to it. There we go. Starting in March last year, we saw countries around the world responding with massive investments in social protection. And while the fact that nearly every African country today has put in place some kind of social protection intervention to address the pandemic, there are still enormous coverage gaps. And I think Christina is going to talk more in her presentation about the social protection responses. But let me just focus on one key dimension of the response, how child-sensitive social protection can tackle the issues of food insecurity and malnutrition. And there are 4 main ways I want to emphasize social protection can promote food security and improved nutrition. First, it can advance rural development. It can better enable the supply of food so that countries are able to produce reliably and sustainably enough food. There are a range of programs that directly strengthen rural infrastructure. Social protection builds human capital, which enables farmers to better cope with crises and sustain their production. And the second component, access, is one of the main ways social protection addresses food security. The core instruments of cash transfers and food transfers support people having access to enough nutritious food. But in doing so, that access role also supports availability because it stabilizes the demand for food and increases the profitability of the rural sector. More complicated is the third pillar, where social protection can interact with other social protection plus sectors, health, education, water, sanitation, to improve the utilization of food and translate into improved nutritional outcomes. And finally, social protection can stabilize all of these areas and ensure that availability, access, and utilization are not negatively affected by severe shocks. Now, we could spend the rest of the day talking about the evidence on these 4 areas. I want to just zero in on one particular dimension, particularly important for Africa, and that's how child-sensitive social protection, how an integrated set of investments in children can integrate health and education and nutrition, stimulation and protection, and contribute to cognitive capital development as the best possible investment in social protection. Now, I want to highlight this investment component is secondary. The reason social protection and child-sensitive social protection is so important is because it delivers human rights. But we also see enormous developmental impacts from these investments, and in particular, nutrition, along with its complementary investments, enable young brains to develop. And I want to highlight why that's so important. This evidence here from Nobel laureate James Heckman's work and clinical data illustrate how vital investments in the early years are for the brain's development. And I'm not just talking about the brain, I'm talking about all the capabilities that are seated in the brain, not just hearing, not just vision and hearing, but quantitative skills, language skills, conceptualization, all these skills that collectively determine the ability of that child not only to have a happy childhood, but to transition into adulthood productively and able to contribute to the social and economic life of her family, her community, and her nation. James Heckman's analysis demonstrates that the most productive investments are investments in food security and nutrition prenatally and in the first few years of life. Now, I'd qualify that today, and I'll come back to this in a minute. In normal times, it's the highest yielding public investment a government can make. Today, investments in COVID vaccine equity, again, a key social protection priority, would generate returns of $180 for every dollar invested. So I would qualify this investment in early years, second highest rated return on investment today. But once we get over this crisis, it goes back to the top of the spot. And of course, it's not just in early childhood. Throughout the life cycle, it's vital to maintain these investments. School feeding programs, other social protection initiatives are vital throughout the life cycle to maintain this investment. We'll hear more about school feeding programs from Enrique just a little bit later today. Now, one reason this is so important for Africa is because Africa faces a demographic challenge, and for a few more decades, a vital demographic opportunity. This graph here illustrates dependency ratios for Asia and Africa, and a couple countries in particular, Japan and China, that over different periods of time have generated massive rates of economic growth. It's easier to just look at the left side of these graphs. Falling dependency ratios, that is the number of dependents for every worker in a country or in a region, have helped to propel in Asia some of the fastest economic growth and the most massive wealth creation the world has ever seen. If workers have more and more resources to invest in their own productivity, they're able to produce more, raise their productivity, and grow the economy faster. And that top orange line that you see represents the low and lower middle income countries in Africa. And you can see that dependency ratios have been falling slower in Africa than in Asia. Now, let's look at the other side of that diagram. In Asia, over the past few decades, dependency ratios have started to rise. And that has made it really difficult to maintain high rates of economic growth. I can't go to an economic conference in Asia without hearing about the middle income trap. How do you continue to raise living standards if there are fewer and fewer workers for every dependent? Well, economists have only one answer to that problem, and that is you got to find an investment that can raise labor productivity faster than populations age. And that investment is integrated, child-sensitive social protection, which generates, according to the International Food Policy Research Institute, returns as high as $18 for every dollar invested. And these returns pay off over a long-term horizon. This is vital for tackling the key challenge of food insecurity and malnutrition, because just tackling the symptoms is not enough. What we need is a comprehensive investment in development to build the resilience and ultimately the prosperity that will address the food insecurity challenge. And social protection is that instrument. Over several decades, an overwhelming evidence base of impact studies and other evaluations have demonstrated how effectively social protection contributes to at least, and I would need hours to go through all of this evidence. I just want to focus for the next 5 minutes on 3 key hows. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more on these hows and other approaches to using child-sensitive social protection to tackle food insecurity and malnutrition. But let me highlight what I think are the big 3. First of all, universal child benefits. They're the most effective way to tackle universal shocks. What we've seen has been a massive increase in new vulnerability. Pre-existing social protection systems, particularly in Africa, have struggled to cope because they've been mostly focused on historic poverty and vulnerability. Universal social protection is the best way to deal with future shocks, and universal child benefits are the best place to start. Now, there is a role here for progressive realization and beginning with more universal approaches and then progressively scaling up to reach all children, starting with the youngest children, but with other interventions like homegrown school feeding programs that have strong developmental impacts. And speaking of homegrown school feeding programs, they're an example of integrated social protection plus. Integrated approaches are vital to achieve this developmental impact. And part of this integrated development requires a greater global commitment to vaccine equity. The pandemic has been one of the key interactors in the crisis, the key interactor in the global food insecurity crisis and its impact on Africa. And tackling that crisis is of paramount importance. This is going to require a massive investment and stronger global leadership. But I want to focus on, for a minute, the evidence on why integrated approaches are so vital. If all we focus is on food security or even nutrition as a sectoral investment, will never generate the kinds of impacts required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That goal is zero stunting by 2030. And this evidence, this is a stylized graph. I'll get to the empirical evidence in just a minute. It shows what happens if you double your spending on nutrition programs. If you scale up the most successful nutrition-specific programs at great cost, you might reduce stunting by 20%. That's nowhere near the Sustainable Development Goal of a nearly 100% reduction. you increase spending by that amount again, and you might reduce spending by just another percentage point. You can look at this curve and you can see that no matter what you spend, you're never going to get to zero. Integrated investments, combining health and education, water and sanitation, maternal care practices, a big push in integrated development does two important things. It shifts this curve down and it steepens the curve. A big investment is still necessary, but you can get to zero. It's not just about spending more, it's about spending better. And this evidence from Ethiopia is the best example I know. We look at the Waredas where there is very poor interaction across sectors, and we see a curve that will never get to zero. But in those Waredas where intersectoral synergies are effective, we see a much steeper curve and districts on track to leave no one behind. The last point I want to make is that social protection must begin to enable people to access inclusive digital technologies. One of the greatest inequities in Africa right now is lack of internet access. And as I mentioned before, the pandemic has demonstrated how costly this gap is. Social protection has long understood how important cash transfers are. This pandemic is demonstrating how vital well-being improving information transfers are. And this needs to be a vital area of intervention for social protection in the future. Thank you.
네, 기조 강연 잘 들었습니다. 마이클 샘슨 소장님께서 이 식량 문제를 해결하기 위한 사회 보호의 역할에 대해 다뤄주셨는데요. 식량의 적절한 공급, 그리고 식량에 대한 접근성, 적재적소의 식량 소비, 그리고 안정적인 식량 공급의 4가지 요소는 매우 중요한 구성 요소로 작용한다는 점 잘 짚어주셨습니다. 또한 식량 문제는 인권과도 아주 긴밀한 연관이 있다고 하셨는데요. 다음 주제 발표에서 더욱 자세한 내용을 들으실 수 있을 것 같습니다. 네, 다음은 셜리 가테니오 게이블, 미국 포드엠 대학교 교수님을 모시고 아프리카의 식량 불안과 아동의 취약성에 대한 발표를 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and good morning to all, and perhaps good afternoon to you as well. And Michael, thank you. That was a great presentation, and I really appreciated how you brought in all the different factors that affect. I also want to thank the organizers for this event, for bringing us together on a topic that is often neglected in our conversations. And special thanks to Sergei Zelenev, whose remarkable abilities of persuasion are undoubtedly the reason that many of us are at this conference today. So as I read over the impressive list of conference participants, I couldn't help but think that the path forward would actually emerge from this group, and it would be none too soon. So my remarks today are going to shift a little bit, and part of that is because lately I've been doing conceptual work, and also because of my background. So I am a social worker, and I tell you this because social workers are trained to understand the lives of individuals within the context of their relationships with others, communities, organizations, and policies. Social workers help individuals and groups navigate the social and economic systems to achieve their goals, often advocating for system-wide changes along the way. So when I approach a social issue, such as food security for children, I first look at the different systems, how they interact with children, and then look for ways to make them better. I believe you will all agree that children should be protected from violence, exploitation, and abuse. All children should have the food they need to nourish their growth, to reach their potential. Yet millions of children worldwide from all socioeconomic backgrounds across all ages, religions, cultures, and countries suffer violence, exploitation, hunger, and abuse every day, and millions more are at risk. And so I ask you, is this justice? Despite all our advances in technology, human rights, education, health, and well-being, have we created a more just world for children? So I've been on this twisted journey for the past year, trying to understand if we have created a more just world for children. Quite honestly, I find myself asking more questions than getting the answers I'm seeking. The first of which is, what is justice? So trying to understand how justice is defined, I read texts from Aristotle and Plato and Nozick and Sen and Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Buddhism and much more. It was fascinating and it did leave my head spinning. But from this query, I emerged with the understanding that there are many different definitions of justice, and that ultimately justice is fluid and is always in the eye of the beholder. So justice, if I can sum up, is defined by our ethnocentrism, our preferences for practices and values reflective of our own culture. And in cultures that include subcultures, it is often the dominant viewpoint or the view of those who control the culture, wealth, politics, religion, or other sources of power, that is used to inform a culture's definition of justice. Justice to a marginalized community may look very different than the dominant culture's view of justice. And justice in the end is defined by an individual's position within a society and is time specific. The benchmark that we use for just or unjust treatment of children will naturally differ depending on the time and contemporary culture. For example, it was the practice in ancient Rome for parents who could not afford to raise their children to leave infants in recognized spots in the woods where they would either die due to hypothermia, hunger, thirst, or animal attack, or perhaps be collected and brought up by strangers. It wasn't until the year 1313 that the Emperor Constantine outlawed this kind of infant abandonment or exposure. Instead, he made it legal for fathers to sell their children when they could not afford to care for them. The new law reduced exposure and thus saved many infants' lives, but legalizing the parental sale of children brought other issues. And it took until 374 for Rome to officially decry the sale of children as unjust and outlawed. Our definitions of justice certainly have evolved over the 1700 years that have elapsed since Constantine first declared child abandonment as unjust. And each time they have, as they've evolved, they've contested our expectations of childhood and the responsibilities for children. Our new perspectives on justice tend to arise from tensions over contending perspectives of justice. This is what makes justice fluid. Issues of justice arise when people can advance claims to freedom, opportunities, resources, and so forth, that conflict with the existing status quo. In contrast, when people's interests converge and resources are bountiful, we reallocate without cries for justice. In our increasingly polarized world, we live with great many inequalities with regard to income opportunities and life circumstances. And so it follows that we have widely divergent views regarding justice today. So it should be no surprise that after decades of mounting inequalities and inequities across and within countries, most recently fueled by a pandemic that reinforced disparities, we hear loud, resonating calls for justice. I honestly cannot understand how anyone can view a child's suffering as just. Regardless of who their families may be, what resources a child's family may or may not have, children should not live in poverty and hunger. They have not chosen their lots in life. In many societies, we withhold social benefits from adults when we want to motivate them to work harder or reward these adults with food, shelter, cash, and healthcare when they live up to our expectations. But why do we do this with children who in most countries are not responsible legally for their maintenance? By any measure used to count the number of children in poverty, child poverty was on the decline since 1990. And then COVID-19 happened and reversed this trend. There are an estimated 1.2 billion children in poverty worldwide, and as many as 1 in 2 children live in extreme poverty. Researchers estimate that the COVID-19 pandemic plunged an additional 150 million children into poverty. Research also tells us that it will take 4 to 5 generations for a child to born into poverty to reach the average national income level. And while this increase in child poverty is being seen worldwide, the largest increases are expected in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where child poverty rates are already the highest in the world. Even before COVID, as the number of children living in extreme poverty was decreasing in most parts of the world, the number of children living in extreme poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa increased from 170 million in 2013 to over 250 million by 220. Across the African continent, nearly 60 million children suffer from stunting due to malnutrition, and over 150 million children, or 1 in 4, live in a conflict zone. Girls in West and Central Africa face the highest risk of child marriage. And last year in West Africa, the Ebola outbreak left tens of thousands of children without parents. Prolonged and frequent droughts across the Horn of Africa is leaving children and their families struggling to survive. As the risk of COVID-19 continues to be ever present, children in Africa without access to basic sanitation and healthcare are more at risk than ever. If current trends continue, over 300 million children living in Sub-Saharan Africa will be living in extreme poverty by 2030. These children will account for 55% of the world's poverty in 2030, over 3 times the share of living in extreme poverty in 2000. So why this poverty? Well, the reasons for poverty and malnutrition are political, economic, and social. And when we fail to address this comprehensively, we inadvertently create more poverty and hunger. So we've heard from several speakers, and we'll hear from more today, who are very knowledgeable about social protections needed and the changes in food production that need to be made. And I support these proposals to bolster, social protection systems increased educational opportunities, rethink food sources and food delivery. But I want to add a caveat to this. Droughts, floods, disease, crisis will no doubt be part of our future, but how we react is less certain. We need to understand that different perspectives on justice, especially for children, because if we don't understand these different perspectives, our solutions will not be sustainable. The programs we create from our bird's eye view don't necessarily address the lived realities, conflicts, and cultures of children. A culture's sense of justice informs us of ways in which resources are distributed and why. A culture's sense of justice for children enlightens us about the role children hold in a society and the tensions that exist in that society. And I think about Michael's presentation where he, talked about the intersections of these different systems that we have to think about as we go forward. So if we want to introduce systems that will usher in sustainable change, they must reflect a society's sense of justice. And we must remember that no two societies' views will be alike because each holds a unique sense of justice. And this is very important, I think, to those of us who do this, because we often want to find the program or the one solution. And what I'm trying to reinforce is that it can't be the same for across the board. So every child deserves to grow up healthy, educated, and protected from harm. But far too many of the world's children are being robbed of their childhoods and their futures. Perhaps agreeing on this as an injustice is a first step toward bringing greater justice to children. Thank you.
네, 게이블 교수님 발표 잘 들었습니다. 감사합니다. 식량 문제가 특히나 아동들에게 끼치는 영향에 대해 생각할 수 있는 기회가 되었습니다. 네, 다음은 드리스 게라위 모로코 사회복지협의회 이사가 아프리카의 농업과 식량 안보의 미래라는 주제로 발표를 해주시겠습니다.
Thank you, my friend Jazahan, for your kind word. And thank you to all my friends in the ICW, especially our president, our executive director, and Sergey for organizing this important meeting. My communication is about the future of agriculture and security, an African perspective. In the context of the pandemic crisis, food is beginning to take a strategic position in the process of globalization currently increased, and food agriculture is becoming an appropriate sphere for capital profitability and diversification of its investment opportunity. We are therefore facing a phenomenon that jeopardizes the future of food security in the world, especially in Africa and Latin America, and which is a great concern for the Food and Agriculture Organization, is the massive purchase of agricultural land in the countries of the South by foreign investors, particularly by a few countries seeking their own food security. These facts call for a new perspective of the perspective role of agriculture and farmers in this region of the world, and to raise the issues of nutrition and food security under new conditions. The first phenomenon has to do with the growing process of increasing scarcity of agriculture and food items production, particularly water, lands, rangelands, and forests. This takes place within a demographic context that maximizes human pressure on this essential element, to creating a tendency towards overexploitation of land, water, rangeland, and forest to meet farmers' daily requirements. The second phenomenon is an even more important dimension and more sensitive for the future. It's the one linked to the sanitary aspect of food and the production of agricultural goods necessary to the satisfaction of the daily nutritional needs of the population throughout the world. This feature has started to draw the attention of policymakers, scientists, and consumer associations. The new situation raises the issue of health monitoring and food safely in our society. If these are the major reasons that justify the importance of examining issues related to the future agriculture and food security, in what context are African agriculture evolving in relation with this issue? The first characteristic of this context is, first, a high polarizer international market of food products. The world market for agriculture and food products is highly polarized and concentrated both in terms of space and by product. Most of the world's production is carried out by a few large regions and countries, and a few producers make up of giant agro-food firms that concentrate on the most strategic products like cereal, sugar, meat, and dairy products such as milk, butter, and cheese. The second characteristic of this context is a highly liberalized market and agricultures that are advantageous subsided. In addition to the polarization concentration of the world market for agriculture and food products, the current liberalization of the international market essentially benefits to the major producing countries and the large transnational agri-food networks. At the same time, non-producing countries, especially Africa, which represent the large part of this market, are increasingly dependent on food, and their deficits in strategic agricultural produce are growing. The third characteristic of this context is that a market that is becoming more and more uncertain because of climate change and the COVID pandemic impact. The present situation of the world system reveals that this is a definite like of cause and effect between the nature of economics and social model that has been inherited from the 20th century, climate disruption, and emergence of new pandemics. Indubitably, and many serious independent studies have proven it, it's the description of this balance that is at the core of development of new generation of food, water, and energy security, and their consequence on the epidemiological evolution in the world, as well as on the acceleration of natural disaster, of extreme phenomena, and of climate migration. This self-destructive logic is leading us to an unpredictable world where the development of ecosystem, ecological, technological, and social irreversibility is very detrimental in the medium and long term for global human security, especially for food security, and especially in Africa. What's the possible answer to this issue and challenge? There are some national solutions as to increase the cultivated agriculture areas, to increase crops yields, and to increase the frequency of harvesting by reserving new varieties and development of season crops. One important thing to point out at this level is that children are and will be the ones most affected by the deterioration of agriculture and food production conditions, especially in Africa, a continent that will experience greater impact from climate change, as well as from new generation of pandemics and insecurities. It's for this reason that children needs to be a priority in food program around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that school children has been the most severely affected by this crisis. This has consequence of their nutritional balance following the confinement and sanitary measures that led the closing of schools, and with them the school canteen. School canteens are the only means for these children to achieve a balanced daily diet. Morocco, with a long history of school feeding, is no exception to this trend. The last report of the World Food Programme in 2021 has shown in this concept of school feeding indicator by country that the number of beneficiaries of school canteens has increasing from 1,042,000 children in 2030 to 1,267,000 data children. In addition to this observation, the Moroccan experience is not worthy for several reasons. It's based on an integrated global strategy that relies on several programs that have either direct or indirect impact on the food situation of children. 3 of these programs deserve particular attention. The first program is called the National Initiative of Human Development. Launched by King Mohammed VI on May 2005, this initiative includes 4 programs, 2 national programs, the cross-cutting program and the program to combat poverty, and 2 territory programs, the program to fight social inclusion in urban areas and the program to combat poverty in the rural areas. This program benefits for 403 rural communes where their poverty rate exceeded 30%, and to 2,064 urban neighborhoods in 3 cities selected because of their lack of basic social infrastructure, high school dropout rates, unemployment, poor housing, poverty, and low income, and because of the high rate of women's and young people exclusion and the lack of training and integration opportunity. The second program, called the Taysir program. This is a nationwide program based on direct cash transfers to benefit poor households with the requirement that their children, especially girls, attend school. The amount of these direct aids to encourage schooling, Taysir, varies between 16 and 140 dirhams per child and per month, accordingly to the level and the cycle of education, and this throughout of school years. The third program is called the Royal Initiative 1 Million School Bags. This is a program that aims to guarantee the minimum condition for equal opportunities for children of the country each year by supplying 4 million poor children in rural area with school bags containing school supplies and books that are adapted to their needs accordingly to the level and cycle of their schooling. In addition to these projects, which are directly linked to the schooling of poor rural children and children living in the suburban of fragile and vulnerable urban and peri-urban areas, the nutrition component of children's lives is also taken into account in the National Nutrition Strategy implemented by the Ministry of Health. Morocco has acquired a very instructive experience at all these levels. This experience, acquired through a partnership with the World Food Programme since 1978, has demonstrated that school feeding helps to improve the level of education of children and to strengthen their capacities thanks to the impact of school canteens on the retention of children in school, the volume of school dropout, and student absenteeism. It also reveals that the program implemented has a great and direct impact on the beneficiary students' desire to learn, encourage a love of school, and promote a culture of hope for a better future due to effects of education on their insertion in the economy and society, and consequently on their social mobility. The reduction of extreme poverty and hunger, and the goal of ensuring primary education for all and promoting gender equality and women's employment, we have to admit that these programs are still burdened by numerous dysfunctions. These dysfunctions touch on two essential dimensions: the governance and the approach and method. In terms of governance, the school canteens suffer from irregularities in the contracting of public supply for these canteens because the persistence of rent-seeking situation, the monopoly, and the corruption and cronyism practices. Also, in the absence of the strict application of the rule of free, fair, healthy, and loyal competition on the one hand, and of effective monitoring, control, and accountability procedures on the other, it's likely that the achievement of this program can be thwarted in terms of efficiency. Hence, the importance of setting up a permanent mechanism to ensure responsible management and transparent organization for all school canteen supply channels. Moreover, in terms of approach, what is important is not so much to provide poor children with school food, but that this food be integrated into a vision, national and global vision, that includes the development of sustainable and durable agriculture, supported by the promotion of local food practices in anticipation of climate change and in line with the requirement of the transformation of agriculture model and system for meeting food needs inherited from the 20th century. And what's the lesson for the future? From the above, it's essentially to draw two major lessons for the future. which are bearing on the agriculture and food issues in Africa. First, a necessary change in the agriculture model. This change implies moving from a market-based production-oriented agriculture to a sustainable agriculture based on a new generation of agricultural activities that allow farmers and African agriculture to produce more, but better and longer, with less land, less water, less fossil energy, less pesticide and chemical fertilizer. This means more biodiversity, nutritional quality, and clean energy within the framework of a primary goal that is the satisfaction of the population needs, and especially children. Two is to change the food consumption model. This transition will require moving from a system of meeting the needs based on waste and nutritional anarchy to a balanced and responsible diet. This consumption model involves four prerequisites: to train and to educate the citizens, especially children, in these new practices of consumption, to inform them about the benefit for man and nature of these practices for consumption, to organize the channel of production and the networks of exchange in relation to these practices, and to use the new technology of information and communication, in particular the media and social network, to mobilize the citizen and their association for consumers defense, as well as those of the people's parents, to set up themselves in true counterpower and coalition in favor of this new conception and production model. However, this is a global issue. The successful implementation of new generation of agriculture policies and food strategy of security in line with this new vision requires coordinated and supportive international governance, which is involved, produces, and makes the major transnational agro-food network accountable. Today, we are witnessing a true agricultural revolution with new agrobiological technology being applied to plant and animal genetic engineering. This new revolution, which heralds profound transformation in the food habit for the 21st century society, is meant to respond to the urgent needs to foresee the technological condition required to feed a world population that will grow to more than 9 billion people by 2050. That's why a coordinated global governance of this new generation of food is very important for the future. Thank you for your listening.
네, 바로 이어서 세 번째 발표입니다. 파페 엘룽두 예네게 코넬 대학교 교수님이 식량 불안에 대한 4가지 인구 통계학적 관점과 정책 시사점을 주제로 발표를 해주시겠습니다.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the conference. I think this is a very exciting conference, a sobering but exciting conference. And I think the sobering remarks that we heard in the introduction drive home the point that more than ever, we need policies that are impactful, that are strategic, and that are actually transformative. And the sessions that we have already, the presentations that we have already have started to guide us in the direction of these transformational policies, and I hope I continue in the same direction. I'm going to make, and as a demographer, I think my argument is going to be perhaps predictable, but I hope it's going to be a compelling argument. And it's a 3-point argument. The first point is that population is half the food security equation. if after all, providing food security is just to giving food to the many, you have to worry about food, but you have to also worry about the many that are supposed to receive the food. And so that half of the equation sometimes has been neglected or misunderstood or underestimated, in part because of a tendency to equate population with population growth, which is a legacy of Malthus. There's also a reduction that has tended to focus food questions to food production. And I think what I'm going to say as a first point is that there's more to population than population size or population growth. And likewise, there's more to food security than just food production. And so I very much echo the call from Dr. Njoro early to think in terms of broader food systems. The second point that I'm going to make is that, well, population matters conceptually. If we embrace a broader understanding of population, then we are going to see many more pathways of possible intervention, many ways in which, many levers in which we can actually improve food security. But at the same time, population matters empirically. The field of demography has tools that can actually complement the tool from microeconomics and from nutritional science, and to bring together, to bring at a big picture level, the analysis of the impacts that we see at the micro level. And so if you think about how you improve, you reduce the vulnerability of different groups, you have to also consider what difference it makes on a big scale. And so I'm going to just discuss some of these tools and maybe just give one example to give you a flavor. And so I'm going to end with a plea to not forget population and to suggest, as we think about addressing the food insecurity in particular, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa today. Because by integrating population, we are going to find new ways to think about mechanisms, the times to intervene, the means of intervention, the milieu in which we are intervening, and the magnitude of the effects that we can have. And so that's really the gist of my point. And I'm going to take these points one at a time. The first point, which I'm going to make and should be straightforward, is that population is half the food security equation. It's a full half of the food security equation. Now, if you think about food security and you think about the macro indicators, if you think about, well, maybe rates of malnutrition, underweight, the percentage of students stunted, or the calories per person. What you have essentially is a very basic equation in which you have in the numerator the amount of food produced, and in the denominator, population. And so you want to take care certainly of the top piece of that equation, but at the same time, you must consider this denominator, the second half of that equation. And this is also true. Another way to look at the rationale or to argument that population is half the equation is if you look at things in a more compositional manner. And this can be done on the scale of Africa. You can see any society has different subpopulations that are at different levels of vulnerability. And so you may have sort of the bottom group here that is more, maybe more or less vulnerable than the top group here. And so groups differ in terms of their relative vulnerability, but they also differ in terms of their relative size. And so the macro picture that you're going to get is going to be a function of both the relative vulnerability of different subpopulation at the same time as the relative size of this subpopulation. And so the result that you have to obtain at the micro level is going to be a composite. So you have to think about how to reduce vulnerability among groups, but you have to also think about how the relative sizes of your different subpopulation is changing. And so the point here is that population is half the equation. Now, this half of the equation have often been obscured, misunderstood, and underestimated, in part because of what I call the legacy of Malthus. And in Malthus' formulation, which made front and center a clear claim about the relationship between population and food, and it was sort of this sort of very strict and rigid tension in which essentially you focus on population growth as an impediment to continued food security, and then production as the other element. So it was relatively reductive. It was focusing on the size of populations and the growth of this population. And yet, as I would argue, there's more to population than the size. There are other variables that are equally important, and in fact, more important than population size and growth. You have questions about population distribution, the age structure, fertility rate, family structure, life cycle events, cohort, and et cetera, et cetera. So all of these demographic variables tend to be not systematically studied, and that's unfortunate. While the same legacy, Malthusian legacy, has placed emphasis on food production as the main worry. Again, here it's reductive because beyond production, we have to think about food loss. We have to think about distribution, physical distribution, economic distribution, social distribution, and we have to think about waste. And so the call here is to embrace a more comprehensive understanding, a more comprehensive integration of the concepts of population, the concepts of food. Essentially, think in terms of the broader system. And in terms of the broader food system, you think about all these chain of events from production to conservation, transportation, post-harvest loss, distribution, and so forth. And thinking about how you can make a difference at each of these points. Likewise, you also think about different elements of population system, birth rates, migration, age structure, et cetera, and where you can make a move, where you can make a difference, okay? So that's the first point. Let's have a broader conceptualization of the relationship between population and food, in which we take a systems approach that is comprehensive. Now, when we take this approach, we are going to have many pathways in which population can affect food security. And here is sort of a short list, my short list of pathways. And you can see they're all different. They all invoke or focus on different population variables. It can be population size, urbanization, and so forth. They also impinge on different elements of the food system. It can be production, it can be transportation and access, it can be economic access. And there are different levels of analysis. Some are very macro in terms of their scale of analysis. Some are more micro. And so I'm going to just take you quickly through these 5 perspectives and provide not really evidence, but sort of a glimpse of what the situation might be in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa in general. And so if you take the first perspective, which is Malthusian, looking at population growth and food production, the idea here is that the rates of population growth are a problem. If you have a population that grows very fast and certainly faster than the rate that productivity, then you're going to essentially hit a snag where I think you're going to face food shortages. Okay, and so if you, there's a lot of debate as to Malthus's main point and the extent to which human technology can overcome the strictures of slow growth in food production. But if you just take a cross-sectional analysis today across all African countries and looked at the relationship between crude birth rates in a country and the prevalence of stunting, you actually do find this sort of a positive relationship that is not trivial. Countries that have higher crude birth rates are also having higher rates of stunting. Okay, so this is circumstantial evidence. There are many things that can be raised here, questions of ecological fallacy, the levels of analysis, whether it's really a true causal relationship, but at least there's tentative evidence that this population growth or birth rates are not necessarily trivial. Okay, so that's the first perspective. The second perspective is sort of geographic and the role of urbanization. And one of the ideas here and one of the ways in which urbanization can play into the picture, among many other ways, is that as you have more people moving into the cities, you have an increased distance between those who produce the food versus those who can consume the food. And so one thing that is needed now is going to be improved system to getting the food from the farm to the table. And so if you don't have a good road infrastructure, then you run into a problem. And so what I do here is just look at, assuming that the geographic argument is valid or has some validity, what you would expect is that, well, rates of malnutrition or stunting, etc., are going to be higher in urban places if you have this friction of space, if you have poor road infrastructure. And so what I show here is data from Demographic and Health Survey showing the percentage of children who are underweight. And so these are the blue bars here, and you can see across the rates are pretty high in some countries, above 25% in the countries here at the bottom. And then the little red here is the ratio of urban to rural ratio. Essentially, do children in urban places have higher rates of underweight than children in rural places? And the answer is no, because all of these numbers here tend to be below 1. And so essentially that is consistent with Dr. Njoro's call for paying greater attention to rural children. In fact, this really, if geography is only a problem because of physical distance, there's not really evidence that geography or urbanization is a major factor. Now, this does not preclude the possibility that you have urban slums where poverty, stunting, etc. is a problem. But as a general principle, rural children actually tend to be more deprived and likely to be more underweight, undernourished than urban children. Okay, so that's the second pathway. The third pathway is age structure, and I think Dr. Sampson talked about this in his early presentation, is that many African countries are at a moment where declines in dependency ratios, that is the number of adults that care for one child on average, that number is on the rise. And so here it opens a window of time during which, because you have more, fewer children per adult, it becomes easier to provide for these children. So for instance, Sudan here is on a path where this decline is occurring. And so this is an opportune time to make inroads into improving the economy in general, but in particular investment in children, educational investment, nutritional investment. And this is a good timing, but also the time is short, because after a while that window is going to close as you start having an aging population. And if you take the case of Tunisia, this is in blue here, you have sort of that closing of the window of opportunity in Tunisia. So many African countries, I just took 2 countries here, but if you drew the totality of African countries, many are at a stage where really there's an opportune moment to take advantage of declining dependency ratios to boost investment in the human capital of children. So that's the fourth argument. And the fifth argument, which is a more within critical perspective about intra-household relationships, and it has to do with the family structure and the role that women play, the leverage that they have in making a childhood decision. And one one hypothesis here, which is maternal altruism, is that the more women have a control, the more children are going to benefit, and the greater the share of household resources that is going to go to children into their feeding, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you look at data for African countries, this is DHS data, Demographic and Health Survey data, the most recent for each country. If you first look at the x-axis here, what this shows is that most countries are at the left, to the left of this bar. That is, in most African countries, fewer than 80% of women report having a substantial say in making large purchases, including things about decisions about buying food. Okay, so that's one first worrisome observation. Now, if you look on the y-axis, what the y-axis is about is essentially the premium from being employed as a woman. In other words, do women who are employed for pay do they tend to have a greater say than women who are not employed? And so if employment doesn't matter, you're going to be here at 1 or below. And what you can see here is that most of these countries here in West Africa, etc., you have a high premium of employment. And so there would be gains to be made by empowering women, including via employment. And assuming, again, this assumption of maternal altruism, this is going to have benefits for children. And so what I've done here is basically go through a number of pathways, a number of arguments that make the case for the role of demography, although albeit different elements of demography, not just population size, but family structure, age structure, et cetera, and how they can play into improving food security. One thing that I skipped, I think the slide is missing there, is and which is also worrisome, is the inverse relationship that you have between fertility and income. The reality in all of African countries is that family in the bottom quintile, wealth quintile, systematically have more children than families in the top quintile. And what this means is that you have severe inequality, severe resource inequality among children, because the poor have sometimes twice or 2.5 more children than those who are in the top quintile. And again, that's a concern. So first point, a broader view of demography opens a conceptual window to think about many pathways of influence on food security. Second point, demography also has a number of tools that can actually help expand policy analysis and policy evaluation of programs, especially when you are interested in the big picture, in the macro level picture. A lot of the interventions that we do are on a small scale, child feeding programs, school feeding programs, cash transfers, etc. And you can actually see the micro impact. But if you are interested in the big picture, if you want to aggregate things and see how this adds up at the level of the country or at the level of the entire continent, you need mechanism, you need tools of aggregation that give you a sense of how well you do in the aggregate. And so there are tools of analysis within demography, because essentially demography is about studying large population, that you can use to better understand this big picture and its relationship to the micro impacts that your projects are going to implement. And I'm going to just emphasize one tool here, which tool of decomposition or aggregation. And so that tool can show you a number of things. You can see, for instance, if you're looking at the entire continent and its situation, and you're trying to understand the gains that are achieved over time, you can better understand whether these gains came about as a result of real transformation in the rates of food security versus changes in the relative size of countries. And you can also identify the countries that made the greatest contribution to the change, including countries that pulled the continent back. And so this is a summary analysis, and I'm just going to guide you through this very slowly. For the entire African country, at least the countries that have data. Unfortunately, key countries such as the RDC and Niger are not included here, and that affects the result, but this just gives you a sense of what you can do. And so if you look at the picture, between 2005 and 2018, to see how the rates of undernourished in the entire population has evolved. These are the undernourished rate in individual countries. These are the relative size of these countries relative to the African population. And so the weighted average here gives you the undernourished African population, which was 21% in 2005. It declined to 17.5 13 years later, which was an improvement, or at least a reduction in undernourished of nearly 4. And so if you want to understand how much that, why or how this reduction came about, how much this was due to population processes and growth of different countries, relative growth of the size of different countries, versus the gains in the actual gains that different countries have achieved. You do a decomposition analysis and the results are here. And essentially what these results tell you here is that we have a -8% here. And what this says is that Africa as a whole would have actually achieved gains that would have been 8% higher if you had not had faster growth in countries that were underperforming. And I think this 8% is actually an underestimate because Niger and the DRC were excluded. You probably would get close to 15 or 20% if they were excluded. So population has acted as a brake, especially faster growth in the population in underperforming countries. Okay, so it sort of slows the progress down to some extent. You can also look at the contributions of different countries, how different countries have contributed to this gain in the situation. And so you can see I ranked the countries here in terms of the contribution to the total gain for the region. And so some countries have made a positive contribution, a large and positive contribution. And if you see here at the bottom, some countries have made a negative contribution. And so you can actually identify and realize that only 4 countries, Ethiopia, Angola, Sudan, Tanzania, account for nearly the entire gain of the entire region because they basically drove the boat. They drove much of this progress, improvement here. So the 4% here, the 4-point improvement here ought to be put in perspective. It's really driven by 4 countries. At the same time, it was slowed by a few countries here. Had these countries not underperformed, again, we would have gone further ahead. And Nigeria was one of these underperforming countries, Madagascar, and to a lesser extent, South Africa. And so that breakdown helps you drill down and understand the makeup of the progress that you see over time. And you can actually project this forward and simulate what would happen to the total picture if you focus attention on sort of a subset of countries. You can sort of carry the same analysis within the same country by looking at different subpopulation, different regions of the country, different socioeconomic groups. And essentially what I'm saying here is that decomposition analysis gives you a sense, a better way to understand the big picture, the impact at the national level or at the regional level that you can achieve with impact with intervention in different subpopulation. All right. And so to conclude, what I'm saying here is, first of all, a population is half the food security equation, but population is more than just population growth. That factor has tended to be obscured by our tendency to focus on population as its size. There's more to population than its size. You have to think about age structure, you have to think about urbanization, fertility size, family structure, gender relationship, life cycle events, and so forth, right? And population matters both conceptually, but also empirically, because it gives us some tools to better understand how we get the big gains at the national level or at the continental level. I think Michael Sampson, and I'm going to end here, suggested that, well, making progress is not just about spending more, it's about spending better. And to me, spending better means spending in the right places, spending in the right subpopulation, spending at the right moment. And so some of these indications that we have here would be maybe spending on empowering women, spending in early years, thinking about unmet need for contraception, thinking about the youth bulge and how this employment can be created for this youth in a win-win situation in which they would be employed in a child care and child nutrition sector, et cetera, et cetera. And so again here, tools of demographic analysis, but also a broader understanding of population can contribute to current efforts to to improve food security in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
네, 발표 잘 들었습니다. 인구의 증가와 연계한 식량 문제를 통계학적 관점으로 해석해 주셔서 푸드 세큐리티의 문제를 숫자로 이해할 수 있었는데요. 지금 시청하고 계신 분들께서도 채팅창에 다양한 의견을 남겨주시기 바랍니다. 저희가 이후 추첨을 통해 작은 선물을 보내드릴 예정입니다. 여러분의 적극적인 참여를 부탁드립니다. 네, 이렇게 해서 네 분의 발표를 함께 들으셨습니다. 이제 다음 두 번째 세션으로 넘어갈 텐데요. 아프리카 식량 불안정 문제 해결 방안에 대해서 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 2부의 첫 번째 순서로 엔리케 델라모니카 유니세프 데이터 분석부 책임님의 발표가 준비되어 있는데요. 발제 주제는 아프리카 학교 급식 프로그램의 경험과 교훈입니다.
I'm just going to present very briefly, very quickly, some of the debates that, at least in my view, frame some of this discussion specifically about school feeding programs, which, as it was discussed by many of you, starting with Michael earlier today, is but one of the means, one of the interventions. I want to present some evidence. I think a lot of that is well known, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about equity and the impact of COVID. There are a couple of things that I'm not going to be talking about. I'm not going to be talking about something that the previous presenters made very clear, which is the connection among interventions. A lot of what I'm going to be saying about school feeding programs is related to the availability of agricultural products, and I think that's important. However, if there is time, maybe after the question and answers, I would like to present some maps about poverty, because we have child poverty estimates at the subnational level that we can cross-tabulate with a lot of the issues that were mentioned by the three previous presenters in terms of population dynamics, environmental issues, family structure, agricultural production, etc. So I think that would be interesting. If there is time, let me present the way I like to capture the debate about school feeding program. Nutritionists don't like it because they say it's too late. The important period is in the womb, it's in the first 3 years, it's in the first 5 years. By the moment the child is in school, stunting, etc., it's done. We cannot fix it afterwards. That's number one. Number two, teachers don't like it. Teachers don't like it because they say we have all these children that come to school not to learn but to be fed. They bring their older siblings or the younger siblings, and it disrupts the school environment. I think both of those arguments are short-sighted, and I think there are a lot of good reasons why we should continue with school feeding programs, including the effect it has on dietary quality, in cognitive development, in reducing food insecurity, reducing stress, all of which leads to a better quality of life for children. The children's experience better quality. They learn about nutrition. They learn models about how to eat. They learn models about how to share. It promotes inclusion, which is one of the fundamental objectives of social protection. So if we think of school feeding programs as a fundamental piece of an overall social protection system, I think there are many good reasons to not only keep on doing school feeding programs, but expanding them. That being said, social protection, including school feeding programs, need not be only about food provision, but also about the quality of that food. And this is something that Professor Gurawi earlier today, among others, have also mentioned. You know the numbers. All of you probably know the numbers even better than I do. Global coverage of school feeding programs may be around 1/3 of children, with huge variations from continent to continent, with huge variations from country to country, which I'm not going to show, with huge variation within countries. And this is what I want to mention and spend a couple of minutes on. The issue of equity. Yes, it's great that there is a lot of coverage, and some of the colleagues mentioned the data from the latest World Food Program document on school feeding, yes, large and expanding, great. But there are differences within countries. There are qualitative issues in the design and the implementation of school feeding programs, which sometimes might lead to stigma and discrimination, which can be avoided when we do geographical targeting, which is a way of providing some sort of local universality. But a lot of these are focused on arid or semi-arid rural areas, where obviously there is a lot of need, but there is too little still international support, funding, interest, and even national on the urban children that also need support. And there are many ways to promote equity and to provide universality, as it was mentioned by Michael, by Shirley and others before. Universality is the basically sine qua non of social protection. Social protection is to be considered as a universal approach, among other reasons, because it's a universal right recognized by the international community since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II. It is also in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So we have some numbers on equity, and this is on equity spending on school feeding for countries in Africa. We don't have a lot of information, even from other countries, for other regions, but that's information for Africa. And we can see the huge disparities in terms of the share of the expenditure that goes to the bottom 20%, right? A version of equity would be the bottom poorest 20% should receive at least 20% of the expenditure. And you see there are countries where they are receiving half of that. Now, why is this important? I would like to link this not just to the issue of equity and fairness and justice, social justice, as Shirley was mentioning earlier today, but also to the other point that Michael made about it's not about spending more, but about spending better. And I would posit, I'm sure that Michael, you agree because we have discussed these things in other venues, spending better also includes spending more equitably. The next graph is a little bit more complicated. I apologize for that. It's the ratio of the expenditure that goes to school feeding programs, not as a proportion of the bottom 20%, but as a proportion of the population who are monetary poor in the country. Because the bottom 20% could be all the poor, could be half of the poor, could be twice the percentage of the poor if monetary poverty is only 10%, as it is in some countries, fortunately. So here we look at the ratio, what goes to the poor and what percentage are the poor in the total population. Simple example. If the poor are 35% of the population, we look at the proportion that goes to the 35%. If the proportion that goes to the 35% happens to be 35%, then this ratio is 1. And that ratio shows sort of equity. They get, the poor get as a proportion of the expenditure exactly the same amount as the proportion they are of the country. If the number is more than 1, it means the poor are getting more than their population share. If they are getting less than 1, as you can see, it is the case in many countries, the poor are not getting out of the investment the government makes on school feeding programs, even the share that they are in the population. I was planning to show another graph, but I couldn't find enough evidence on the geographic distribution. Not just urban rural, but also across provinces or states or municipalities. And that's something I would like to come to at the end of the presentation. Impact of COVID, as you know, large disruptions, including in schools. We know that school feeding programs represent about 10 or 15% of daily family income among some of the poorest households. So this is an extra impact of COVID on the poor, on top of they cannot work. and obviously they lose their income, right? So Sub-Saharan Africa, fortunately, compared to other regions, suffered less from the impact of school closures. I didn't highlight here Northern Africa because I didn't have the information separate from the rest of the Middle East, but even there we can see that in most countries the situation in terms of school closures is not as bad. And I think it's important sometimes to highlight some of these positive things. Now, we cannot precisely assess the impact of these school closures on school feeding, partly because of the data limitations I was mentioning earlier, but it is possible to get sort of a minimum value. When we look at the minimum value, we estimate that about 400 million students from primary and lower secondary education missed school meals due to COVID in the previous school year, right? Most countries have been on vacation the last few months. Some countries are starting school systems again, but in the previous academic year. Latin America was the hardest hit. Sub-Saharan Africa was not the hardest hit, and it's surprising, but it's not good news, I'm sorry to say. The reason for that is that the baseline of coverage of children with school feeding programs in these countries was low to begin with. Of course, if it's a low number to begin with, when there is a reduction, the reduction doesn't seem too big, but proportionally is big, and it's important. Just a couple of words on the response to COVID, because there is a lot of harm that is done to children when they miss school meals. They obviously become more food insecure. They are vulnerable to other hardships, and it's important to replace the nutritional value that they lost. And when we shift from delivering the food at school to do it at the household level, we miss something which is crucial from the perspective of children about the school meals. That food goes to the children. If we do the delivery at the household level, we are not 100% sure. Now, some of you will say, children take the food and bring it home. Yes, that happens a lot. But by and large, the food is eaten by the children at school. And we know that then that is a direct transfer that improves the rights of the lives of children and fulfills or satisfies some of the rights of children, the right to food in this case. Finally, two further points linking to the issues that the other colleagues were mentioning. We know that we have to embed the school feeding programs in the larger social protection schemes and the other policies that promote well-being and the rights of children, including the specifics of education, reducing psychosocial stressors, etc. Finally, all of these, one way or the other, costs money. It needs to be funded, and it needs to be funded in a way that is fair. We don't want to fund it by taxing whenever the poor consume food, because that would be regressive. And we need to finance it in a way that is sustainable. That means eventually it needs to be funded with local resources. Of course, more ODA should be allocated to these resources. To do that, sooner or later, we need to confront the elephant in the room, which is the issue of how to raise revenues in a way that promote inclusion, that promote fairness, which means we have to take from those that have more, who are usually reluctant to give more, in order to be able to give to those that have less. In this case, the children that should go to school not being hungry. I want to stop here. I think I have spoken less than the allocated time, only because I want to give time to the other colleagues. And as I said, I might want, if possible, at the end to show a couple of maps to invite colleagues to some joint analysis and research. But I'll leave that for the question and answers. Thank you. Over to you.
네, 발표 잘 들었습니다. 아프리카 지역에서 실제 운영된 학교 급식 프로그램에 대해 다뤄주셔서 조금 더 생생한 발표였던 것 같습니다. 다음으로는 줄리 뉴턴 네덜란드 왕립 지속가능개발연구소 책임연구원께서 식품 시스템 접근을 통한 새로운 기회를 주제로 발표를 해주시겠습니다.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for having me here. Again, it's quite a privilege to be amongst so many experts, and I'm delighted that I was invited by Sergei to be part of this panel. Before I dive in, and I'm going to try and be very good on the timing, so you'll just have to tell me when I go overboard. A little bit about my perspective and the angle that I'm bringing here. I come from an applied knowledge background, so I'm coming from this very much first as an academic and then working in the applied work with lots of different stakeholders who are actually doing gender work in social protection. So what I'm hoping to share with you today is some of my key observations of what I've been seeing as we go along. So first of all, why does a gender lens matter and what do we know already? Well, the good news is that actually we know quite a lot already. We know that, and a lot of you have already talked about it, that poverty, risks and vulnerabilities are gendered and that these vary across the life course. That's been quite an important point that has been recognized. And that these play out differently for different women and men, but particularly children and women are the most affected, and that this has a cumulative effect across the life course. So we know, for example, that with young girls that the burden of high unpaid care work and domestic work can have further repercussions about their access to education and therefore their position in the labor market. And there are other risks around wage gaps and so forth. And then on top of that, there are these gender norms, for example, related to early marriage, which further compounds these issues. So we know that that's important, and the evidence is pointing to that. And some of your colleagues will be aware that there's a great report that has just come out very recently from UNICEF and UN Women, which goes through an analysis of, I believe, around 40 different programs across the world looking at the evidence. And what they point out so far is that most strategies and programs out there do recognize these gendered risks and vulnerabilities, but not equally across the life course. These tend to focus mainly on women of reproductive age. And I think we know why that is, because of with food and nutrition security, that critical window of intervention around 1,000 days. This review also highlighted that there are many structural inequalities related to women in particular that remain ignored. These relate again to the burden of unpaid care work, also strong representation of women in the informal workforce, and the risk of gender-based violence. And these continue to be ignored in these pieces of work. The other key message they highlight is weak integration of a gender perspective into the monitoring, evaluation, and frameworks. And the implication of that is that it reinforces the status quo. So we're seeing these inequalities deepen, and they're not being addressed through these social protection schemes. And it's reinforcing the status quo. So what this really highlights is the importance of design. And there are lots of ways around the how of how you design these social protection programs in terms of targeting, modality, conditionality, and so forth that do matter. But the challenge is that we need more evidence about the nuances there to better track the impact of those changes so that we can see which ones are more effective. And that's a very important message takeaway to take forward. What is the link to food and nutrition security? I won't spend too much time because a lot of you have already talked about this, but I think this is quite nicely highlighted in this recent diagram from the Interagency Social Protection Assessment Tool, which looks at the different programs that can be used and the pathways and the outcomes leading to food and nutrition security through social protection. And what I want to do, again, with my gender lens and the background that I bring, is another key message is to recognize the impact of these frameworks on different framings of gender, because they also play a role in reinforcing some of these pitfalls of how we address gender in the programs. So I wanted to take us back in time to some of those key frameworks that you'll remember were key in highlighting the important role that women do have in food and nutrition security. These were the UNICEF framework for malnutrition, which you'll recall puts inadequate care for mothers and children right at the center of driving food and nutrition security outcomes. We had the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, which put the focus, as you were saying, on the critical 1,000 days of intervention as an important window. And then we had the Lancet special issues, and particularly the one in 2013, which made this link to food and nutrition sensitive social programming, which was key. And what was important about these is, yes, they highlighted the important role of women in food systems, but the danger is that it very much treated it zoomed into women and looked at gender in terms of framing as roles. And what happened is we saw in terms of programming, and then this includes social protection program, there was a lot of emphasis on targeting women with conditional cash transfers, also behavior change programs targeting women in the critical 1,000 days with behavior change messages. And yeah, it was focusing exclusively on their role as mothers and the only primary caregivers. And it put a lot of onus on women as the only custodians of food and nutrition security without taking that household approach and looking at gender as a social relation. And that's an important message I would like to leave with you too, as you go forward in your different pieces of work to look at gender as a relation between different women and men across the life course, and not just at roles. So this is an important message that I would like to leave you with. And you can see how this is reinforced through other frameworks, because again, I've zoomed in here, this framework I just showed you here, the targeting, again, you see poverty, 1,000 days, and the emphasis on women again, not looking at gender as a social relation. Now, since then, we have the rise of food systems thinking, which is great. And there are, again, a lot of frameworks out there. This is the one that I'm more familiar with, working in the Dutch context. And yeah, I won't dive into the details here, but they're all familiar. You have the food system outcomes, classic food security, nutrition outcomes here, and then the different drivers across the activities. And the added value, I think, from a gender perspective is this multi-level and holistic framework, which is useful because then you can start looking at these complex causal mechanism and trade-offs and synergies. But again, let's watch out for the pitfalls. So, and again, a recent high-level panel document from food systems, I don't know if you can see in the slide, but again, zooms into highlighting gender inequality as important, but zooming into only looking at women and again on their roles without looking at gender social relation. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but what does this mean for going forward? I don't have time to go into detail, but a few things that I would like to leave you with. Again, if we zoom into this left-hand corner of the box, understanding processes, if we go back to where I started, that recognizing that these risks and vulnerabilities are gendered across the life course, we can use that lens to look at how gender as a social relation interacts with all those parts. And that means looking at how women and men have different access to resources and how that impacts decision-making about who decides how these resources, in this case, cash transfers, for example, are shared within the household. And using that lens is particularly useful for unpacking this in more detail. And we already saw in some of the early presenters, zooming into decision making, for example, is a really important indicator to dive into more detail. The last contribution I would like, which really inspires me in my work, working with policymakers, NGOs, and researchers around gender integration in a range of food and nutrition security programs, is this typology of gender outcomes, which has come in the last, I would say, about 5 years. And this is what I would argue is when we're tracking the outcomes of different social protection programs, in addition to the classic food and nutrition security outcomes, we should be looking at gender outcomes as well, because this will really help us address that gap that I highlighted earlier around better monitoring and evaluation systems of different social protection programs. And from the recent advances in gender and agriculture work, there are new metrics there. Some of you will be familiar with the Women Empowerment in Agriculture Index and the latest iterations of that, the project level weigher. And this allows programs to really tease out who are they reaching through different social protection schemes, who in the household is benefiting that, and really diving into how those resources are being shared at the household level, and diving into empowerment here. And this is a common misconception that also happens, that if you get a resource, you're empowered. But what we know from the gender research is that this really needs to look at the decision making and the choice, and who has the voice about how these resources are shared within the household, which is key. And then we have the fourth layer, which is transformation. And this is really about measuring attitudes and norms at different levels, household, community, and institutional level, about whose voices count in how social protection schemes are allocated and at policy level. So to conclude, some key messages that I would like to leave you with is be mindful of your own roles in these frameworks, about how they can reinforce certain framings of gender. And I would encourage you to move beyond roles, but really looking at gender as a social relation. So that's not only who's doing what, but who has access to these resources, what is the decision-making process around how those resources are shared. And again, reinforcing what existing research already tells us, we need a solid gender analysis of these risks and vulnerabilities to inform the design of child and nutrition sensitive social protection. And to support us in gathering that evidence, I encourage you to look at this Reach, Benefit, Empower, Transform tool to help in the tracking. And last but not least, we recognize a lot in the gender work that we do that there is a need for capacity strengthening to support different stakeholders in that analysis, and to translate that analysis into practical design and to track that in the future. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
네, 이제 마지막 세션 순서입니다. 마지막 세션은 지금까지 살펴본 내용을 바탕으로 새로운 사회 안전망 구축을 위해 통합적인 접근 방안을 살펴보고자 합니다. 먼저 ILO의 크리스티나 베렌트님께서 나와 계시는데요. 발표 주제는 갈림길에 선 사회 안전망, 위기 대응에서 보편적 사회 보장으로입니다. 발표 함께 하시죠.
Thank you very much, Amsen, and thank you a lot also to the organizers and to all the speakers before me. And it's really a pleasure to be part of that discussion. And in fact, I think all the speakers before me, they have made, on the one hand, my job very easy, because a lot of the issues have already been addressed. But on the other hand, it has made it more difficult, because it's just, I don't want to duplicate things. But I mean, allow me to maybe take a step back and look at the systems perspective. And I think several of the previous speakers, they have already referred to the importance of building social protection systems. And with that, and I mean, Amson, you have already referred to the World Social Protection Report. I will also include some references to the most recent edition, which has just been launched last week. So if I can manage here the slides. And let me maybe start with kind of one key lesson from the well, still ongoing COVID crisis. I mean, we have seen how much social protection was part of the policy response in many countries. But what we have seen is kind of basically two different ways or two different challenge of responses. Especially in countries where social protection systems are already quite strong, countries could take automatic responses through existing social protection systems. So they could really mobilize them and also channel additional resources through the existing mechanisms. But we have also seen that the crisis has really highlighted some key coverage gaps, and that has needed to put in place some emergency responses to close coverage and adequacy gaps. And this was focusing in particular on those who were not previously adequately protected, including those, for example, who are in the informal economy, also specific measures to address food insecurity. But quite often, given that still countries had to build on what they already had, by and large, even though many countries took some very innovative measures, they were still quite limited and temporary and really kind of on a one-off measures. So there's still an existing challenge when it comes to social protection in general, but also when it comes to access to food and also the quality and nutrition of food. So, but I think this has brought us to a point which is really a critical crossroad for social protection. I think many governments have realized that they need additional investments in social protection, given the experience during the crisis. And so there is, I think there is a good policy window at the moment to really advocate for strengthening social protection systems and strengthening universal social protection systems. And universal does not only refer to ensuring that there is universal coverage, but it also refers to the fact that in the protection, the level of benefits, the access to services needs to be adequate, it needs to be comprehensive. The systems need also to be sustainable, and they need to be adapted to the situation. But at the same time, there is a risk, especially given the fiscal pressures, that countries might nevertheless choose a low-road approach of minimalist social protection policies, just relating to some kind of small safety net programs under the pressure of fiscal consolidation, so that they're not really mustering the political will that is necessary to take this high road to social protection, which is really necessary not just to address the challenges that have emerged during the crisis, but also to address the structural issues that were there before with regard to high and growing levels of inequality, with regard to hunger, to inadequate nutrition, etc., etc. So I think this is really now a critical point in time. And as we have seen, and you have mentioned there is a huge challenge when it comes to inadequate coverage. And I don't want to go into the detail here, but just looking at the overall picture when it comes to social protection coverage, we can see that there is a large challenge in Africa compared to other countries. I mean, other countries or other regions also have their challenges when it comes to limited coverage, but the challenge is particularly large in Africa. And I think this again calls for additional action and investment. We have seen, and I think in the interest of time, I'm not going into detail here, But for example, when we look at benefits for children and families, again, we see the challenge of very limited coverage. And you can see that on the map, especially for Africa, where the coverage rates are really extremely low. So I think there is really a need for more policy action in that respect. And I think it's quite encouraging that there is a larger interest in universal child benefits, and several of the previous speakers have already referred to it. And I think this is certainly one of the interesting and important and promising policy areas that could be looked at. But I think it's not only about cash benefits, but it's also about access to services. And obviously making sure that people have access to quality nutrition, to healthcare, to childcare, and water and sanitation. So I think this is really a package that calls for an integrated approach. And when we look at investment, and with that I'm kind of referring back to the elephant in the room that Enrique has referred to previously, there is obviously a huge challenge when it comes to investing in social protection for children, which is very low compared to, I mean, in Africa, it's very low, and especially in low-income countries, it is very low. So this calls for an additional effort to invest in social protection. When we look at social protection expenditure and also health expenditure, in more general terms, I think there is a broader challenge when it comes to significant underinvestment. And this again calls for a high road approach to strengthening social protection systems. We need to secure sustainable and adequate financing for social protection. And I think in that respect, and a combination of tax-funded benefits financed through progressive taxation and inclusive social insurance is important. But also I think we should be looking also not just at social protection itself, but we need to look at a broader set of policies that are well coordinated. And I've already mentioned access to services, which is important, but I would also add policies that address the broader context, including employment policies, macroeconomic and fiscal policies, and policies to support also the transition from the informal to the formal economy. And I think this is really important also to address some of the structural challenges that exist. Maybe one more point, and one more really making the case for investing in universal social protection. The ILO has estimated the financing gap that exists for financing at least a basic level of cash benefits and access to healthcare. And it has estimated that actually this financing gap has increased due to COVID by 30%. So this financing gap that exists for a social protection floor, and this estimate is based on an estimation of the cost of universal child, maternity and disability benefits, universal pensions, and access to essential healthcare. And for example, if we look at what would be needed for countries to really build their social protection floor, and I mean, we should also emphasize that this is not a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, but there is also a need for countries to define exactly how their social protection floor looks like. But for the sake of this estimate, we have based that on a kind of a more generic model. And for low-income countries, this would require 15.9% of their GDP. And so this is obviously a level of expenditure which is difficult really to mobilize for these countries in a short time. So this also calls for international solidarity really to support those countries to build up their social protection systems. So, and I think this is really quite a strong call. It's at this particular moment to invest in universal social protection. And so what's needed, and this will be my last point. And I would also like to highlight that actually this is not just kind of the key message of the World Social Protection Report, but also that the International Labour Conference just in June this year has adopted two important policy documents. One is a global call to action for a human-centered recovery, and the other are resolutions and conclusions on social protection, social security. And both actually call for universal social protection and really those increased and additional investment and a joint and coordinated effort to really get to a situation where countries can really build their social protection systems. So what would be necessary as a priority? The first, I think countries need to look at their social protection policies to reinforce them, guided by international social security standards and supported by effective and inclusive social dialogue. I think it's an absolute priority to close coverage and adequacy gaps, certainly for children, but I think we need to take it also broader and look especially also at the situation of women, closing gender gaps and really making that transformation that we just heard about in the previous session, looking at also at improving the situation of workers in the informal economy, migrants, and really looking at ensuring that social protection is not just kind of a very kind of low benefit, but it's really aiming at adequate protection for everyone to really reduce vulnerability, promote decent work, support life and work transitions, and really allow and enable and empower people to better navigate the future. And I have already mentioned an integrated approach, which is absolutely essential for that. And I'd like to close with really and I would assume that you would probably agree with that investing in universal social protection is really the ethical and rational choice for a better future. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
다음으로는 국제사회복지협의회 UN 대표부 세르게이 젤레네브님의 발표를 듣도록 하겠습니다. 사회안전망을 위한 파트너십 구축을 주제로 발표를 준비해 주셨는데요. 지금부터 함께 하시죠.
Gaining a better understanding of the multidimensional nature of the challenge of food insecurity, and particularly, of course, we are talking about children, can facilitate concerted actions. I think that one lesson which is learned listening to numerous speakers from the representatives of IFAD and then Michael and many other presenters from the universities, and of course, presentation of Christina Behrendt, they underscored the importance of the integrated and complex solutions and the commitment of multiple stakeholders. Only through that we can hope that food insecurity could be reduced decisively. As urban and rural food insecurity often require different approach and different responses by local governments. And again, this was underscored by the presenters before. So given the extreme poverty and hunger in Africa, which is mostly rural phenomena, investment in agriculture and rural development are vital prerequisites for eradicating hunger. But here there is a caveat, I think. Improving agricultural production and integrating social protection schemes for consumers with social protection for small local producers, it's a kind of two-pronged approach, and it could be seen as a way to address the poverty and insecurity of the latter in the context of promoting sustainable development. I think that here it is noteworthy to mention that vulnerabilities should be addressed in such a way as that can break the cycle of disadvantage across generations and build intergenerational solidarity. I think this issue was also mentioned by Professor Parfait. I guess that it is very important that it facilitates overcoming adversities such as food insecurity within families and communities. Next slide, please. So, as far as the intergovernmental efforts, we can definitely say that partnerships were absolutely essential to address the devastation caused by COVID. And they were recognized even earlier that SDG 17 seeks to encourage and promote effective public, private, and civil society partnerships. So in this sense, as I said, a sort of normative consensus has emerged, building on the experience and the resourcing strategies and partnerships. And it's interesting that the report, which tried to evaluate implementation of SDGs, the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, recognized that major transformations in areas like energy system, health, food, and urbanization make it necessary to radically rethink partnerships between science, government, the private sector, civil society, and more. I think the key word here is rethink. And I would probably add also increase and enlarge. So kindly next slide, please. The UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund is one of the examples of the emergency response initiated by the United Nations. I think that for this audience, it is well known that this fund has been said. It is interagency finance mechanism launched by the Secretary General to support low and middle income programs. And it has three windows, enabling governments and community shareholders to tackle the crisis by supporting the implementation of national health plans for combating COVID-19. And I would like to draw your attention to the window two, reducing social impact and promoting economic response by funding social and economic protection mechanisms, scaling up cash transfers, broadening social protection schemes, and meeting the educational and food security needs of the children. And this, of course, also emphasizes the crucial role of digital innovations, particularly for in this response to COVID, that boost employment and strengthen social security delivery and healthcare provision. And finally, window three, to recover better and together, is strengthening national preparedness measures. Unfortunately, again, we have to say, to reiterate what Christina mentioned, that there is a financial gap here, and the resources channeled through the fund are well below what is needed. Next slide, please. Another response at the global level is ACT Accelerator, which is a framework for collaboration. And this is the world's most comprehensive end-to-end solution to ending the acute phase of the pandemic. So this mechanism is led by WHO and partnering with the world leading international health organizations. Again, it is aims at bringing scientists, businesses, civil society, and philanthropists to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to COVID-19 tests, treatment, and vaccines. Unfortunately, we have to say again that access to key resources remain a main challenge here. Next slide, please. So, partnering with private companies is important in accomplishing this work during the new normal, how to say. Here, I have a very interesting study done by Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, which is called the Breakthrough Action. It includes such measures as social media campaigns for making COVID-19 prevention information available across countries, helping to navigate vaccine hesitant individuals. We know that this vaccine hesitancy is not a phenomenon exclusively of developing countries. It is very visible in many developed countries as well, which prevents people from getting vaccination, or actually they are resistant to that. And also importance of encouraging sick people afflicted by the disease other than COVID to seek medical attention and help even in the time of the pandemic. This is also quite an important response provided by private companies in this context. Importance for businesses is that they are growing their exposure, building goodwill and strengthening their reputations when they align with governments in the search for solutions. And this is actually gains legitimacy and credibility when they are considered as trusted partners of government efforts. Please, next slide. A way to success is three main points, and this is has been summarized by DESA report on transformational partnerships and partnership platforms. They are proven, or it's an evidence-based report, that key success factors of COVID-19 responsive partnerships have included leadership and vision, trust, alignment of interest, flexibility, commitment, and adaptive governance structure. I guess that this will be very important for building partnerships later, and for building also social protection cooperation effort in the post-COVID time. But communication between partners, access to key financial and human resources, and uncertainty given the rapidly changing conditions have been some of the major challenges in the creation and management of partnerships during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So what lessons from Africa we can see now in these difficult and challenging times? First of all, food security in the broad sense, availability of food and its availability at affordable prices is a prerequisite for child-sensitive social protection. But it is not a guarantee in the absence of special policy measures aimed at children. And gaining a better understanding of the multidimensional nature of the challenge of food insecurity should be a joint effort for all partners if they hope for a success. Again, shared vision regarding key objectives and trust among partners, between partners, is absolutely essential for any success. And of course, policy success is achieved when the stakeholder with their own comparative advantages join forces and bring their skills, bring their competence, their commitments, and their networks. Then it becomes a success. Next slide, please. So, as I said at the beginning, there should be a word of caution because public-private partnerships have become a widely promoted notion, particularly by the international financial institutions. And they reflect both through success stories and skillful promotion, using the ideas of partnerships and collaboration as positive attributes is intuitively appealing. But as I mentioned, there is a need to go deeper into this issue and always look at the specific circumstances in the country level. While benefits of partnerships might be much larger compared to its absence, when such key areas, for example, are considered as public welfare, evolution of and impact of technologies, and particularly privacy, which became a key issue in many debates regarding the spread of contemporary technologies. The decisions made within these partnerships have or may have very deep social implications. And this is important, and it should be realized. That's why it is absolutely vital that public has full transparency regarding the shape and responsibilities that are established. And as I said, government involvement is quite essential. And the final slide, please. Actually, not the final one. I will, given that I am already beyond my limits, I would like to say that joining forces as far as the government and the private sector efforts are absolutely essential for strengthening food security. And it is done through fighting poverty, promoting productive employment, and policy aimed at reducing social exclusion, which is, of course, quite often promoted by governments. Also reducing market volatility, better land management. But this is done in cooperation with private sector. And when it is done skillfully, the results are quite impressive. And there are security enhancing measures. Promoting the private sector investment along the whole food chain, recognizing that there is some heterogeneity within this food chain, from subsistence farming, for example, which is prevalent in many countries in Africa, through monopolistic traders, especially improved agricultural trade logistics, fostering public-private dialogue to unlock investment bottlenecks, are particularly relevant in the food security context. And finally, my last point and the last slide is that the role of civil society organizations, it is quite large in many national contexts. And these organizations focus on specific communities and issues. And because of that, it gives them in-depth knowledge and expertise needed to devise practical interventions. Together with partners, they can engage in lobbying, advocacy, agenda setting, and ensuring the accountability of government. This engagement is particularly effective when it is based on evidence and not on a hearsay, and reflects an integrated and comprehensive approach to policymaking. Sometimes civil society organizations, which are quite often inspired by very noble aspirations, they are avoiding evidence and presenting largely normative statements. But to be convincing, evidence is absolutely indispensable. And in this sense, our conference today has been a proof that this evidence could be used for better agenda setting and for better policy making. And also, civil society organizations can help with increasing the efficiency of the food system. For example, reducing the production costs and contributing to a better service delivery, and in preventing food loss and food waste, which we also mentioned as an important part of the mosaic. So alone or in cooperation with other partners, civil society organizations also engage with universities and academic centers to develop and distribute open source and not-for-profit technological advances. And the last but not the least, depending on the national circumstances, such organizations could be valuable participants in the process of identification of social economic policy priorities, including such an important issue as budget priorities, and of course, the existing trade-offs. Many thanks for your attention and my apologies for these technical issues. Thank you.
네, 좋은 말씀 대단히 감사합니다. 지금 현재 우리가 직면한 위기와 그것을 해결하기 위한 사회복지, 사회개발 분야의 구성원들의 노력이 필요하다고 말씀을 해주셨고요. 지속가능 개발 목표의 달성을 위해서도 국제사회의 꾸준한 협력이 필요하다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 자, 여러분 이제 오늘 포럼의 마지막 발표입니다. 이사벨 오티즈 콜롬비아 대학교 사회정의연구센터장님께서 보편적 사회보장과 사회정의 추구에 대해서 발표를 해주시겠습니다.
To close this conference, what I would like is actually to give a bit of the inspiring ending, the high end that my colleague from ILO, Christina Berendt, was saying. What will happen if we remember the important quest for social justice? And for that, I have a presentation, which I hope it works. Very good. So I wanted to remember everybody on the right to food and the right to social protection of social security, which are really imperatives. And if we recall, Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, healthcare, and necessary social services, and the right to social security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or any other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in and out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. So this has been agreed by governments so many times. At the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at the time of the Global Agreement on Social Protection Floors, by which all governments agreed on a recommendation 202, and as well also at the SDGs in 2015. And we're monitoring progress towards that. So all governments agree towards these principles, towards the high end that it was described before. However, very often what happens is that governments say that they don't have the resources to implement it. Is it true? And that's what I would like to question to close. So for that, I also wanted to be a bit more specific. And what I did is costing how much will it be to actually have this universal social protection for in a number of benefits. And here what we have in the next slides are different of these benefits. The first one is how much will be a universal social protection floor for all mothers with newborns in Africa, costing a benefit of 100% of poverty line during 4 months to all mothers with newborns. And how much will it be as a percentage of GDP? And when you have each bar is actually represents a different country. And on the left-hand side, what you have is will be the percentage of what it implies the cost of that for the country. And so you have a variety of, of cost. So the first one, so you see here on the very left is very cheap for South Africa and Namibia because they have higher GDPs. So, the cost will be really very, very low. It is like below 0.1% of GDP. So it will be highly affordable. And for other countries, which are at the right, you see the cost is much higher. In that case is Liberia. For Liberia, it costs 2.2% of GDP. And for Eritrea, it will be as much as 17% of GDP. So it's already a much higher cost that one will think more about it. All these calculations are done using the ILO Social Protection Calculator. You can use it, it's free, it's available online, anybody can use it. And it was updated just prior to the pandemic in 2019. So it may mean that the numbers are not related, but they are good for this policy debate. And also there is a paper that captured all that, which it was produced in 2018, which it was called Universal Social Protection Floors, Costing Estimates and Affordability in 57 Lower Income Countries. And it was published by ILO in Geneva. So the next, it will be how much will be the cost of a universal benefit for all orphans in Africa, estimated at 100% of the poverty line. And so the cost here is actually very, very cheap, almost zero in, very, very low, meaning 0% of GDP. I mean, very low cost for Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt. And it keeps increasing as we move. It's more for Gabon, more for Namibia, more for Mauritania. And it's a bit larger for Zimbabwe and DR Congo, where they go about 0.6 or 0.7 of GDP. Next slide is when things start. So far the benefits have not been very costly, but now they get more costly. So what will happen if we will give a child benefit for all children, 0 to 4 years old? And in this case, it was estimated at 25% of the poverty line, including administrative cost as a percentage of GDP. So what happens is still very affordable for some countries, because they have higher GDP, like South Africa and Namibia. So they go below 0.3% of GDP. But as you see the bars at the right-hand side, they are very high for some countries. Liberia, for instance, it is more than 7% of GDP. That's more difficult to cost. Eritrea, 6% of GDP. Zimbabwe, 5% of GDP. Niger, 4% of GDP. And in the next slide, what we did at the time of the paper, it was actually comparing how much will be the cost of these child and orphan benefits together and how much are the governments spending. And with very few exceptions, and the black dots represent how much our government spending. So the only exception of Armenia, Bhutan, Indonesia, Mongolia, and El Salvador, which actually were spending more on child benefits. The rest of countries really were actually spending far, far, far less. So it means that the high road appears very difficult to them. So what I would like to do is to question that. It is really unaffordable. And what I would like to say, it is, and this is the key message of the presentation, it is really affordable. And financing and fiscal space options exist even in the poorest countries. Okay, and this is a key message of the United Nations. So there are at least 8 options supported by policy statements of the United Nations and also of the international financial institutions. And governments around the world have been applying these different financing options for decades, showing that there is a wide variety of revenue choices for governments. Okay, so what are these 8 options? The first one, and I'm just going to mention them, but it's a publication done with UNICEF, ILO, and UN Women that you can download below. It's called Fiscal Space for Social Protections and the SDGs, Options to Expand Social Investments in 187 countries. So it's also for free, you can download. And so these 8 options, which are just going to mention quickly, are: first, you have to increase tax revenues, of course, through progressive sources. That means avoiding VAT or consumption taxes that very often are the ones that country increase. And that means increasing mostly income or wealth taxation, corporate taxes, including taxes to the financial sector that in many countries don't pay any or very, very low taxes. And for instance, Brazil put a very small financial transaction tax during a number of years, and with that actually financed the expansion of social protection during many years. Until, unfortunately, pressure from the financial sector made that this tax was removed. But that was a pitiful move. Other countries, for instance, like Mongolia or Zambia, are financing social protection through a very small tax on mineral exports. Mongolia was financing a universal social benefit purely on a very, very small tax on copper exports. So it can be done and is doable. Second option, and this is very important now that we're talking about the countries increasing debt because of the COVID pandemic, it will be to restructure or reduce debt. And we have very good examples from more than 60 countries in recent years, for instance, Ecuador, Iceland, Iraq. And so given the very high levels coming because of all the indebtedness happening during the pandemic, it is very important to focus on debt forgiveness and relief. Third will be to fight illicit financial flows. These are large, much larger than ODA. So it's very important to fight them. They're illegal, like money laundering, others. So fundamental to fight them. Fourth will be to have more aid and transfer for low-income countries. And there are very interesting proposals like a global social protection fund. Fifth option will be to reallocate public expenditures, replacing high cost and low social impact expenditures, for instance, defense, the military. And we have very good examples like Costa Rica or Thailand who reduce defense expenditures to invest more in health. Sixth option will be to tap into fiscal and foreign exchange reserves like Chile or Norway have done and invest them in national development. And now this sounds like something like your eyes glaze and you don't understand, but for sub-Saharan Africa, it is actually very important. The IMF had a very important evaluation report that showed that actually for conservative policies, many African countries are keeping lots of reserves in the central bank. And this is something criminal in places where there is food insecurity. It means that the government has a preference to keep the money just accumulated there beyond any conservative rule in the central bank instead of supporting population that might be, dying of starvation. So these things are very important to come up to the public domain and not just be, kept as obscure, policies, macroeconomic policies done by technocrats. Seventh option, and is very important, is for countries that have a large informal sector will be to increase social security coverage, formalizing workers in the formal economy with good contracts. And we have very good experiences in Argentina, Brazil, Tunisia, Uruguay. What they did is formalizing these people that were working in bad conditions in the informal sector with good contracts, and that actually brings, some revenues to social security. And eighth option will be to adopt a more accommodative macroeconomic framework, having some tolerance to inflation or fiscal deficit, as many countries are doing already today. All these measures, what is important to realize is that these options are available and for countries to take, and countries have been taking them recently. In recent years. And what is very important, you see, not all countries can do all of these options, but countries can do a number of them. And what is intelligent is to start getting more resources from here, to a bit of each of the options. So, you can actually expand social protection. And what you have here is the fiscal space strategies for social protection, some country examples. And here you can see from Bolivia, Botswana, Brazil, Costa Rica, Lesotho, Iceland, Namibia, South Africa, Thailand. They carved their space. They got more funds from here, and then, being able to invest more on social protection. Overall, what is fundamental is that these decisions affect the lives of millions of people, so they cannot be taken behind closed doors by some technocrats and the ministers of finance. What is very important in agreement, with international conventions is that they are discussed in national social dialogue, publicly, openly, and with trade unions, employers, government, civil society organizations, all main stakeholders, representative stakeholders in a country, and then discuss openly what might be the possible options, the social impacts, the risks and trade-offs. They need to be fully explored and then decide publicly, not behind closed doors. And so last to finish, so how will you build this high road? How will you do these social protection floors that will eradicate food insecurity forever? So they will be formulating national social protection strategies through this open, participatory national dialogue in accordance with UN conventions and recommendations. So A, you will start a national dialogue as a collective agreement to achieve human rights and SDG 1.3 as part of national development strategy. B, you will identify what are the gaps in social protection, which, as we know in Africa, there are many. C, you will determine what might be at this stage the most appropriate social protection schemes in a country with a time frame. So say now, in the following 5 years, you will do that. In the next 5 years, we will do the other, etc. You will cost, how much will it cost these schemes, as we were doing before, and identify potential sources of fiscal space. And we say these 8 options that we presented before. We'll discuss all that with the Ministry of Finance, which is fundamental because ultimately they have to allow, and through an open national dialogue, you will agree on a national social protection strategy or plan, and that will be discussed openly, as we mentioned. It will not be a technocratic exercise behind closed doors, but it will be agreed nationally by all main stakeholders. And this is fundamental to eradicate food insecurity forever and have universal social protection achieved. These are the references we mentioned, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much.
오늘 포럼에서는 아프리카의 식량 불안 현황과 그 해결 방안, 그리고 사회 안전망 구축에 대한 해외 사회개발 전문가분들의 발표를 들으셨습니다. 저도 오늘 발표를 들으면서 아프리카 식량 문제에 대해 다양한 생각들을 접할 수 있었던 좋은 시간이었는데요. 여러분들도 모두 유익한 시간 되셨습니까? 오늘 포럼에서 다룬 내용을 바탕으로 앞으로도 국제사회는 다양한 주체가 함께 모여 새롭게 발생하는 사회 문제를 지혜롭게 해결해 나갈 수 있으리라 생각하는 기회가 되었습니다. 변화하는 환경과 때론 위협적인 감염병 상황 등 어려운 위기가 참 많겠지만 국제사회 노력이 한 곳에 모여 어려움을 극복해 나갈 수 있기를 바랍니다. 오늘 포럼 영상은 향후 한국사회복지협의회 유튜브 공식 채널인 나눔 채널 공감에 업로드할 예정입니다. 여러분의 많은 시청과 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 오늘 포럼 발표 자료가 필요하신 분들은 채팅창에 이메일 주소를 남겨주시면 발표 자료 파일을 메일로 보내드리도록 하겠습니다. 이상으로 빈곤과 식량 문제를 주제로 한 국제사회 서비스 프로젝트 3차 포럼을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 오는 11월 3일부터 5일까지 3일 동안 포스트 코로나 시대의 사회 안전망을 주제로 4차 포럼이 예정되어 있습니다. 향후 진행하는 SDGs 4차 국제 포럼에도 여러분의 많은 관심을 부탁드리겠습니다. 11월에 다시 찾아뵙겠습니다. 마지막으로 쿠키 영상이 준비되어 있는데요. 끝까지 많은 시청을 부탁드리겠습니다. 오늘 진행을 맡은 저는 김경미 아나운서였습니다. 함께해 주신 여러분 감사합니다.